Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping into the dusty streets of ancient Rome. Not the Rome of grand speeches or toga-clad philosophers, but the Rome where people are bought and sold like pottery priced by age, strength, and accent. You're standing under a sweltering sun, your sandals sticking to the stone as the slave auction crackles with shouted bids and nervous shuffling. You smell sweat dust and oddly cheap olive oil. One man's being appraised like a horse. A girl, maybe 15, is turned around. Her teeth checked, her hair inspected for lice. There's a man in a stained purple tunic shouting prices fast, talking like he's at a fish market. And all around you it's normal, routine. You, on the other hand, probably wouldn't survive this place 5 minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself walking slowly along a row of chained figures. Some are whispering prayers. Some are singing. Some stare into the void. One man catches your eye and holds it as if daring you to bid on him. Welcome to the Roman slave market. Here's the thing, slavery in Rome wasn't just some shadowy backdrop. It was a central engine of the economy. And unlike modern slavery, which rightly fills history books with outrage, Roman slavery was woven so deeply into life that few even questioned it. It's how empires ran. But we're not here to moralize tonight. We're here to understand why these people, these living, breathing humans, had literal price tags, and why those price tags changed across centuries. Let's start with the basics. Slaves in ancient Rome were not all created equal, and neither were their price points. But the whole industry, yes, industry, began to flourish during the early Republic, then exploded during the height of the empire. Why war? Lots of it. You walk past another auction block, and a grizzled auctioneer is announcing in a voice hoarse from years of shouting, "Fresh from Gaul, strong, not yet broken." The bidding starts low and rises quickly. Roman conquests brought in captives by the thousands. After a battle, generals didn't just come home with gold, they came home with people. Entire towns could be captured and sold into slavery. And these weren't just soldiers. We're talking bakers, seamstresses, teenagers, priests, and infants. It got to the point that slave prices temporarily dropped after big wars because the market was flooded with too many bodies. That's right, human lives became cheaper after major military victories. It's like what happens when iPhones go on sale, except here it was someone's mother. For example, after the Third Macedonian War in the 2nd century BCE, tens of thousands of Greek prisoners were sold as slaves. Prices fell so drastically that wealthy Romans began scooping them up like holiday deals. Some noble families even sent letters home like, "Get me 2 Greeks and a cook before prices go back up." The mainstream historical fact here, historians agree that Rome's military successes were directly tied to the economic viability of slavery. The more land Rome conquered, the more slaves it had. But here's a quirky little detail: some slave markets came with warranty scrolls. Seriously, if the slave turned out to be sick or lied about a skill like speaking Latin, the buyer could get a refund, sort of. Ancient receipts weren't exactly ironclad, but they were weirdly bureaucratic. You overhear one merchant bragging that he bought a Thracian boy for just 500 sesterces because the lad had a limp. "It'll heal," he says smugly, "and then I'll sell him for double." The numbers aren't just chilling, they're also fascinating. In early Republican times, circa 3rd century BCE, you might pay 2,000, 3,000 sesterces for a healthy young male laborer. But after big wars, that same body could go for as little as 600. Think about that. The cost of a human being could be less than the cost of a good mule. But supply wasn't the only factor. The demand for certain types of slaves also skewed prices. Remember that young boy with the limp? He's cheap now, but if he grows up to be strong and unbroken, his resale value shoots up. Slave dealers often gambled like investors on future appreciation. Now historians still argue whether these early auctions were centralized in specific markets or scattered across the empire, like wandering carnivals. Some evidence suggests traveling dealers moved with military caravans setting up pop-up auctions like grim little fairs. You walk past a stall with a handwritten placard, educated, can read Greek, cook, loyal. A plump older woman in a stained robe looks down as the crowd eyes her like produce. And that's the real gut punch. In many ways, slaves were marketed the way we market used cars. The nicer the features, the higher the price. One owner household good temperament rarely bites. You think about modern real estate ads and shudder. And yet for a Roman citizen, buying a slave wasn't just practical, it was status. Like having a Tesla or wearing a Rolex. Having 10 slaves, you're doing well. Having 50, you're a somebody. Having hundreds, well, now you're in the history books. Even emperors like Augustus reportedly gifted slaves as party favors. Imagine blowing out birthday candles and unwrapping a human being. There's a joke whispered between merchants that goes, "A Roman without a slave is like a senator without a lie." Light, dark humor. You smirk despite yourself. You keep moving. A child barely 10 is crying softly in the corner. Nobody bids. She's too young for field work, too scared for household labor. You overhear one buyer mutter, "Wait a year, she'll ripen." You feel your stomach twist, and not from hunger. Even in its earliest phases, this system had an inescapable logic. Brutal, cold, but logical. So tonight, as you drift deeper into this ancient marketplace, remember this: the prices weren't just random numbers. They were shaped by war, wealth, skill, gender, age, and raw human bias. They reflected the value Rome placed on strength, silence, beauty, and obedience. And they will change, twist, and sometimes skyrocket as we follow the trail through time. But for now, step quietly around the auction block. Don't make eye contact. Try not to look too curious. One seller's already watching you like a potential buyer or merchandise. You slip away from the seller's gaze and drift further down the line of auction stalls, only to stumble into a very different atmosphere. Here the noise shifts from haggling shouts to barked military commands, from the clink of coin purses to the dull shuffle of chains being dragged across the stone. This isn't a local market. This is post-war spoils on full display. You're standing at the edge of an army camp, but it smells less like leather and sweat, more like desperation and loss. Rome has just crushed another rebellion, this time in Spain, or maybe Greece or Gaul. They all start to blend together, and the generals are unloading their human cargo like surplus goods at a clearance sale. You watch as soldiers, half drunk on wine and victory, parade the defeated into makeshift pens. Most of the captives are ragged, some bleeding, others stunned into silence. Their price low, almost insultingly low. That's the strange economic twist. The more Rome conquered, the cheaper slaves became. With each new expansion, generals would return to Italy, not just with victory parades and exotic animals, but with thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of prisoners. And those prisoners straight to market. This massive influx flooded the supply side of the slave economy. You remember from school how supply and demand work, right? More slaves meant less scarcity. Less scarcity meant lower prices. But in Rome, that meant that the value of a human life could plummet overnight, depending on how well the legions were doing abroad. You overhear a trader laughing. "Last week I couldn't afford a Samnite. Now I got 5. Thank you, General. After the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, when Carthage was razed to the ground, it's said that over 50,000 Carthaginians were captured and sold into slavery. Their prices often less than that of a trained ox. And that wasn't a one-time thing. Take Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, for example. By some accounts, over 1 million Gauls were enslaved over the course of his campaigns. His personal letters, yep, Caesar had receipts, boast of selling entire tribes wholesale. One note claims he sold 53,000 captives from a single campaign season. Now here's your mainstream historical fact. Caesar funded his political career partly through slave sales. Every conquest doubled as a business venture. Win the battle, sell the people, buy votes. Think of it like a military-industrial complex, except instead of building tanks, they built chains and auction blocks. But here's a quirky tidbit. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in slaves. Not in gold or silver, but in living people they could keep or sell later. Congratulations on surviving this siege. Here's a 10-year-old from Iberia. Enjoy. And you thought your work bonus was bad. So what about the buyers who was snapping up this flood of cheap labor? Answer: just about everyone. Rich landowners used them for their latifundia, massive agricultural estates that needed constant, tireless hands. Urban households scooped up educated captives to serve as tutors, accountants, or even poets. And the state itself stocked prisons, shipyards, and mines with this endless human resource. You pass by a different kind of stall now. A small wooden sign reads, "Bulk sale 10 Iberians for the price of 7. It's not a joke. It's a serious offer. Rome was running a 2-for-1 special on people. You pause for a moment and wonder, how did this not break the entire system? Well, here's the thing, it almost did. In fact, historians still argue about how these massive surpluses affected the free working class. Many Roman citizens were displaced from jobs because slaves were simply cheaper. You're a Roman farmer. Tough luck. Your neighbor just bought 10 captives who don't ask for wages or lunch breaks. This tension led to deep class divides and resentment and riots. The Gracchi brothers, for example, tried to reform land ownership, partly because of this, because the slave economy had strangled free labor, and they both ended up murdered. Coincidence? You walk a little further and see a small crowd forming around a particularly tall captive. He's towering, scarred with the sort of jawline sculptors would kill to replicate. The crowd's murmuring gladiator potential. And with that label, his price skyrockets. Even in the middle of a post-war surplus, some captives stood out. That's the hidden layer. Conquest brought quantity, but quality still mattered. A strong, intimidating male who could fight in the arena, worth thousands. A literate Greek boy, a small fortune. A beautiful dancer from the East, name your price. Rome's slave economy wasn't just driven by numbers, it was tuned to niches. You didn't just buy a slave. You invested in a role: gladiator, lover, servant, farmhand, translator, executioner. And each had its own going rate. Now here's a bitter irony. While the markets were swelling with captives, some Roman citizens started faking slavery. Really? Desperate, debt-ridden free men would sometimes pretend to be slaves to get sold for quick cash. They'd take the money up front, often paid to a family member, and vanish from records. This was illegal, of course, but it happened. You can't make this up. You feel the crunch of gravel underfoot as you pass a field now dotted with tents, cages, and makeshift auction blocks. The system is efficient, terrifyingly so. But for Romans, it's just another Tuesday. One trader is recording each sale with a wax tablet, muttering prices and names. He sneezes mid-word and smears the wax. No one checks these anyway, he shrugs. He's probably right. Bureaucracy wasn't always tight, especially in backwater regions after a war. You sit for a moment, overwhelmed. The sun setting behind the hills, casting long shadows over the fields. You think about those Carthaginians, those Gauls, those nameless people whose entire futures were redirected because they happened to live on the wrong side of Roman ambition. And yet, this system, the war-to-market pipeline, was the beating heart of the Roman economy for centuries. Generals needed war for glory, yes, but also for profit. Conquest meant more than land. It meant human cargo. Rome, in many ways, was built on the backs of the very people it conquered. And as the sun dips below the horizon, you wonder what happens when the wars slow down, when the captives run dry, when supply shrinks. But that's for another walk. For now, dust yourself off. A camp dog is sniffing at your feet like you might be edible. Time to move along before someone mistakes you for the next lot. You make your way back toward the city, where the streets are paved not with gold, but with stories of value, of flesh, of whispered deals behind villa walls. You think you've grasped how slave prices work. Now, war floods the markets, prices drop. Simple, right? Not so fast. Because as you wander deeper into Rome's heart, past the rough auction squares and into the shaded courtyards of the elite, you begin to notice something strange. Not all slaves are priced the same. Not even close. You pause at a private estate where two slaves are being paraded before a buyer with a scroll. One is tall, muscle-bound, clearly from the provinces. The other, smaller, wears a tunic of fine linen and holds a stylus in one hand. The buyer doesn't even glance at the brute. His eyes are locked on the boy with the pen. That's when it hits you, not all slaves are equal, and the gap in pricing isn't just large, it's ridiculous. Take two men, same age. One is a strong laborer from Germania who can lift crates until his back gives out. He might go for 2,000 sesterces. The other is a Greek tutor who can quote Homer, teach geometry, and speak perfect Latin with a charming accent. Him 20,000 sesterces, maybe more if his handwriting's nice. That's a tenfold difference for the same number of limbs. The Roman elite weren't just buying brawn, they were collecting minds, talents, and aesthetics. A gifted scribe, a singer from Alexandria, a dancer trained in temple rituals, these were investments, status symbols, conversation pieces. And Rome, with all its violent swagger, loved to show off. Mainstream historical fact, wealthy Roman households often bought skilled slaves, not just for utility, but for prestige. Cicero himself famously kept Greek slaves as literary assistants, scribes who edited his speeches and even ghost-wrote drafts. Imagine your resume saying, wrote Cicero's best lines but got no credit. But this isn't just about skills. Looks mattered too. Beauty could drive prices into absurd territory. A physically flawless youth from the East, especially from regions like Syria or Egypt, might fetch more than a small estate. Why? Because they weren't just bought for work. They were bought for display, for desire, for dominance. You walk by a shop window, yes, shop window. Rome had proto-boutiques for everything, where a stunningly dressed boy is playing a lyre. Above him, a wax tablet reads, polished, educated, trained in etiquette. It doesn't say the price. If you have to ask, you can't afford it. And let's not forget gladiators. You step into a barracks now where a new batch of recruits is being inspected. Their prices are being shouted out over the clash of swords and grunts of exertion. This isn't a military camp, it's an investment floor. Some of these men will die in their first fight, but others, the lucky or brutal ones, will rise to stardom, like living stock options. A famous gladiator. He might cost more than a dozen field slaves, and if he survives long enough to build a fan base, The arena owners double their money in ticket sales and endorsements. One record shows a gladiator named Flamma who was offered his freedom 4 times and refused every time. Why he made more money in chains than most free men ever dreamed of. And yes, owners did profit off branding and merchandise. Romans really were ahead of their time. Then there's the other end of the spectrum, the broken, the sick, the unwanted. These poor souls, often older, infirm, or visibly scarred, might sell for as little as 300 sesterces, less than a cheap donkey. And worse, some dealers bundled them with better slaves just to move the inventory. A kind of buy one, take this old guy too situation. This leads to one of the darkest realities of the system: price reflected perceived potential. Not humanity, not story, just potential. You remember that stylus holding boy from earlier? He's now seated by a fountain being taught Roman court etiquette by a stern-looking housemaster. His training will raise his value. His silence, his smile, even the way he pours wine, all monetized. Meanwhile, another group of slaves is being beaten outside the kitchen, their crime likely something like burning bread or spilling oil. Their prices will fall tomorrow. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit for tonight. There were even rental slaves. That's right, that you could lease a skilled slave for a dinner party, a legal hearing, or even a musical performance. Rome had a proto-gig economy, except you weren't tipping the performer. You were paying the owner. Historians found records of contracts detailing time slots, wardrobe requirements, even liability clauses. If your rented singer dies during performance, you must compensate owner 60% of listed value. Seriously. This raises a fascinating debate. Historians still argue about whether these hyper-skilled slaves were closer to property or professionals. Some were paid stipends. Some negotiated their own sale prices. A few even managed their masters' estates. Where do you draw the line between enslaved and executive? You pass by one such estate manager now. An older man wearing fine robes and barking orders to freeborn workers. He glances your way, then returns to correcting inventory scrolls. He's a slave, yes, but his price today, astronomical. And that's the irony: some of the most valuable slaves in Rome lived lives more stable and powerful than struggling citizens. But a collar's still a collar, even if it's gilded. You walk on. The street vendors are closing up. Someone's lighting oil lamps along the colonnades, casting dancing shadows on the marble walls. You think of all the price tags you've heard today. How many lives were traded not for safety or freedom, but for potential and prestige? You find a quiet bench under an olive tree and sit, letting the warm breeze wash over your thoughts. One man's poet is another man's porter. One woman's servant is another man's silk-draped status trophy. And through it all, the numbers shift and shimmer, never random, never fair, but always calculated, always Roman. A cool breeze brushes past as you leave the wealthier neighborhoods behind, winding through narrow streets cluttered with shouting vendors and donkey carts. You pass under an arched aqueduct and arrive at a quieter stretch of Rome where time seems to move a little differently. The stone walls here are cracked, and the air carries a smoky scent like last year's fire never quite went out. You've spent enough time in the markets to understand that slave prices rose and fell based on conquest and social class. But tonight, something stranger reveals itself. Prices didn't just shift because of supply. They changed with the tides of Rome's economy. You duck into a tavern near the Subura district, half crime alley, half gossip engine, and overhear a few red-faced merchants nursing wine and complaining. One slams his goblet on the table. 3 years ago, a farm slave cost 200 sesterces. Now I paid £2,000. For a barley harvester with a limp, turns out you've arrived during a boom period. But that boom, it's not as shiny as it sounds. When Rome's economy surged, thanks to new provinces, new taxes, and fresh coinage, prices for everything went up. Slave prices included, because when landowners had more coin to spend, they bought more slaves. That drove up demand, and even the least skilled laborer could command higher prices simply because people were buying. But then the opposite happened during busts. War, plague, famine, especially the big three, could crush Rome's economy like a grape underfoot. When there was less money, fewer buyers, and mounting desperation, slave prices plummeted. Mainstream historical fact: after the Antonine Plague hit, in the late 160s, CE, killing possibly 5 million people, Rome's economy nosedived. Farms were abandoned, trade slowed, and the slave markets thinned out, not just from disease, but because people could no longer afford to own other people. Those who could sell slaves did, often at heavy losses. You walk past a slave trader now who's pacing in front of his shop. "Prices are down again," he mutters. "That Cappadocian singer I paid a fortune for, no one wants music during a famine." His teeth grind as he crosses out the price on her wax tag. But it wasn't just plagues or wars. Even Rome's own financial system played games with value. In the late Empire, emperors started debasing the currency, mixing cheaper metals into silver coins. That triggered inflation. Bread cost more. Wine cost more. Slaves sky high again. You reach into your imaginary purse and realize a single slave's cost might jump 500 sesterces in a month just because of a monetary policy change. That's like trying to buy a laptop and watching the price go up every time the emperor sneezes. Here's a quirky tidbit: some traders hoarded slaves during low points, waiting for prices to recover. They'd keep people locked in basement quarters like they were vintage wine, aging them into profitability. One scroll recovered from Pompeii lists a merchant noting, "Hold back Eastern girls. Prices may double after Saturnalia." Yes, they were timing the market with human beings. Buy low, sell high. Classic strategy. Disturbing context. You find yourself standing outside a modest villa, now watching a family argue over household accounts. The mother hisses at her husband. "Why did you buy that translator now? Wait until winter, no one's hiring. We could have gotten her for half, and that's another layer." Seasonality. Just like grapes or fish, slave prices fluctuated based on time of year. Summer was prime harvest time, so field laborers became valuable. Winter demand slowed, and with it prices dropped. Festival season like Saturnalia boosted interest in entertainers and household helpers. Think of it like buying plane tickets during a holiday rush. Rome was running a human economy with a very flexible calendar. But not all of it was logical. You turn into a hallway lined with mosaic floors and find an aging scholar reading scrolls in the corner. He glances up and murmurs, "Historians still argue whether slave prices tracked predictable patterns, or if they were just chaotic reactions to too many variables." Because here's the problem: some price changes don't make sense. Inscriptions show that during certain years, a literate Syrian slave might sell for more than a trained Greek. One town's market might charge double what the next city over did. Regional inflation, local politics, religious festivals, rumors, it all got baked into the final number. There's even evidence that astrology influenced bidding. That's right, some buyers refused to purchase slaves if Mercury was retrograde. Rome loved logic and law, sure, but it also adored superstition. You pass a temple where a priest is refusing to buy a house servant during a certain moon phase. "Her fate is unclear," he says. "Price too risky." And then there's land ownership. During economic booms, wealthy patricians often bought more land, and with that came a need for more slaves. But during crashes, when landlords couldn't maintain fields, they dumped both land and people on the market. At one point, prices collapsed so severely that Roman senators begged the state for debt relief. because their slaves had become liabilities. Yes, owning too many people became a financial problem, and the state responded. You walk past the Senate building now and feel the weight of bureaucracy in the air. Rome passed laws during certain financial crises to regulate slave trade prices. Maximum price ceilings were set. Overpricing could result in fines. Underpricing, suspicions of tax evasion or fraud. One senator jokes as you pass, "You can't sell a Gaul for 10,000 anymore, unless she sings opera." You smirk, then wonder if that's actually a joke. Now here's where it gets weirder. Sometimes Rome used slaves as collateral, especially when merchants needed loans. Bankers would calculate the value of a slave the same way we appraise houses today. A young, healthy slave with technical training, solid investment. One nearing 40 with a bad leg, risky. And yes, foreclosures happened. People lost slaves to debt collectors. In at least one case, a merchant defaulted and lost his personal barber scribe and 3 cooks in a single swoop. You pass a banker now fidgeting with an abacus and arguing with a client. Your cook's too old to fetch that loan. Show me the dancer again. If you thought your credit score was dehumanizing, Rome's system puts it to shame. And through all this, prices remained the barometer of Roman reality. When the economy soared, humans became expensive. When it collapsed, humans were discounted. These numbers weren't just transactional, they were cultural echoes of Rome's mood swings. As you emerge onto a torch-lit street, you think back to those 3 merchants complaining in the tavern. Their frustrations weren't just economic, they were emotional. Slave prices weren't only about cost, they were about pride, power, the illusion of control in an empire constantly shifting under their feet. A gust of wind kicks dust into your sandals, and you feel a strange calm. Because now you see it, Rome's entire rhythm pulsed in sesterces, and human lives were counted in decimals. Tomorrow, the economy might crash again, or spike. Either way, the markets will open at sunrise. And the first item up for bidding, a barber from Bithynia who plays the flute. The sun is rising now over the tiled roofs of Rome, but in the slave pens, dawn doesn't bring hope, it brings inspections. You trail behind a buyer, a plump man in a gold-trimmed toga who's murmuring to himself as he studies the rows of captives like livestock. He pauses at each one, not asking their name, but their age, their health, and most awkwardly, their gender. Because in Rome, just like in every brutal ledger, being male or female changed your price. You hear the man bark, 12 too young, 30 too old, 17 healthy obedient. Yes, let's talk numbers. He's not talking about oxen, he's talking about girls. That's the first thing that hits you. Age and gender together were major pricing levers in Rome's slave market. A young male in his physical prime, say between 18 and 25, trained for fieldwork or military support, would sell at peak price sometimes 2,000 to 4,000 sesterces, depending on his build and origin. A strong, unskilled teenage boy could still go for a solid price, especially in rural auctions where brawn mattered more than manners. But a young girl, that's where things got complicated. You follow the buyer into a more private chamber where slaves are presented with slightly more discretion. Here, the female slaves are paraded like fine art. They're not expected to till soil or push carts, they're expected to serve in households' kitchens or less publicly discussed places. Mainstream historical fact, female slaves were often purchased for domestic service, but also for companionship or exploitation, especially if they were young and considered attractive. Their price wasn't just based on work potential, it was laced with unspoken intentions. That's why some girls fetched extremely high prices, particularly if they were labeled untouched or trained in music dancing or elite service roles. And here's a cruel irony: virginity added value. Roman slave sellers were known to advertise this explicitly. You see one now scribbling untouched, vouched by owner, on a wax placard and hanging it around a girl's neck. She stands still. She's done this before. In contrast, older women, especially those past childbearing age or with visible signs of labor, were significantly cheaper. One merchant scoffs at a 30-something woman's price and mutters, "You feed her for 10 years and she drops dead before she earns it back." That's the language here, a return on investment. Every slave was a calculation, years of service, left cost of upkeep, potential yield. Then there's the other side of the gender coin. Male slaves were often priced for risk. A muscular man in his 20s might look useful, but sellers had to factor in danger. Would he rebel, try to escape, beat his master? Gladiators were profitable, sure, but also dangerous and expensive to maintain. You hear one dealer arguing, "This one's too proud. He'll cost me more in chains than in labor." That's why some buyers preferred women or boys seen as less likely to fight back, more malleable, more safe, at least in theory. Now for a quirky tidbit, in some cases, people actually tried to disguise gender to manipulate prices. Records tell of sellers who dressed boys as girls or vice versa, hoping to fit a more profitable niche. One papyrus even notes a young eunuch sold as a musical prodigy, never mind that his voice had been altered by force. And yes, eunuchs were their own bizarre pricing category. Considered desirable for specific elite households, their prices could surpass even a healthy field slave by triple, especially if they had singing talent or religious training. But their creation was illegal in most of the Roman world, meaning they were often imported, smuggled in like illicit luxury goods. You're shaken from your thoughts as you pass an outdoor bathhouse where slaves are lined up for presentation. Their scrubbed-down, hair-oiled bruises covered with ash or dye. This is marketing Roman style. And gender decides which part of the body gets emphasized, which features get praised, and which get ignored. Historians still argue about whether female slaves were priced higher or lower on average than males. Some evidence suggests male laborers were valued more consistently, while female slaves spiked in price only if they were young, attractive, or possessed rare domestic skills. But in elite auctions, those hush-hush deals behind heavy curtains, young girls often went for obscene amounts. You overhear a whisper between two aristocrats, the Greek one 30,000 sesterces. She sings, she dances. She's a virgin, worth every coin. You keep walking. There's also the matter of fertility. Women who had previously birthed healthy children were sometimes priced for breeding purposes. No, Rome didn't have formal slave breeding farms like later societies did, but household owners often purchased enslaved women with the intent to produce more slaves. Children born to slaves became slaves, no extra purchase necessary. That meant pregnant women were often worth slightly more unless the pregnancy threatened productivity. One merchant complains, "She'll be out of work for months. Who's gonna carry water?" The fetus, you can't help but notice that everything, their body, their biology, their future offspring, is commodified, reduced to math, risk assessment, profit and loss. But here's something rare. As you pass a more upscale villa, you notice a woman in her 30s overseeing servants. She's sharp-eyed, confident. One of the servants whispers, "That's Vibia. Slave, yes, but she runs the whole household." She's expensive, not because of her body, not because of her age, but because she's irreplaceable. Skilled female administrators existed. In fact, some households were entirely run by enslaved women trained in accounting, logistics, even negotiation. Their gender made them underestimated by outsiders, but their owners knew their worth. Their price tags were often whispered with awe. And in rare, almost legendary cases, those women managed to buy their freedom and retire with dignity. But that's for another night. You walk back toward the market's exit, pausing beside a row of iron cages. A girl in one stares at you. She can't be more than 14. Her face is blank, but her hands clench the bars like she knows exactly what's coming. Her price you don't want to ask. You don't need to. You've seen enough to understand that in Rome, gender was currency. It shaped every bid, every sale, every fate. It decided who worked the fields and who poured wine, who fetched 10,000 sesterces and who didn't fetch a second glance. And in a world built on conquest, pride, and coin, your body decided your future long before you ever had a say in it. You leave the cage behind, though her eyes stay with you. They follow you all the way to a quieter quarter of the city, where the clamor of auctions fades into the creak of wood, the grind of gears, the soft rhythm of styluses scratching wax. Here the slaves don't sweat in fields or serve at feasts. They calculate taxes, write poems, stitch wounds, and copy scrolls, and they cost a fortune. Because tonight, you're stepping into the world of skilled labor slaves, the doctors, teachers, architects, and artisans whose hands were often more valuable than entire farms, and whose minds even more so. It begins with a whisper as you pass a merchant's villa, 24,000 sesterces, worth every coin. The man speaks 3 languages and knows where every bone connects. He's talking about a physician, a slave physician. That's right. Some of Rome's most trusted doctors were enslaved, particularly those trained in Greek medicine, which Roman elites respected almost religiously. If you had the coin, you didn't just buy a man to mix herbs, you bought someone who could save your heir's life. And in a society where lineage was everything, that meant paying premium. Mainstream historical fact. Many Roman households, especially wealthy ones, kept enslaved doctors. They weren't just healers, they were family fixtures. Educated, trained, and sometimes more skilled than free Roman practitioners, these slaves might be paid stipends or given luxuries, yet remained property. You walk past one now, a lean man in a threadbare tunic washing his hands with precision. The basin's water is tinted red. A child behind him sobs quietly, bandaged foot extended. No fanfare, no thanks, just routine. His value if he were sold today, easily 30,000 sesterces, more if he specialized in childbirth or battlefield injuries. Then there are the tutors, the backbone of aristocratic education. Many were Greek, dragged across the sea after Rome conquered their city-states. They came from noble families, fluent in rhetoric, logic, and the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle. Yet here they now teach spoiled Roman children how to read. And for that privilege, they're worth a small palace. You peer into a courtyard where a gray-bearded man is drilling a bored teenager on verb conjugations. The boy yawns. The tutor doesn't flinch. He's probably taught 3 generations of that family by now. You'd think that buys respect. It doesn't. It buys a high price tag and a locked sleeping cell. Here's a quirky fringe tidbit. Some slaves were artists and poets commissioned by their owners for decorative frescoes, epics, or love letters. A few became famous enough that their names survived history, but always under their master's name. Imagine ghostwriting an entire book and getting paid in leftovers. You stop at a tiny storefront. Inside, a young man is painting delicate designs onto clay. His owner stands nearby, boasting, "This one from Alexandria. Makes 6 urns a day, each worth 10 times his weight." You count the urns on the shelf and do the math. This slave is earning his master a fortune. Which leads you to a strange but important point. Skilled slaves were profit centers. They weren't just workers, they were investments. Owners calculated their productivity like you might monitor a stock portfolio. A talented glassblower, great margins. A midwife with a perfect record, guaranteed income. A scribe who never misspells a client's name, priceless. You pass one of those scribes, now head down stylus dancing over wax tablets. He doesn't look up. He never does. That's what makes him efficient. And yet the tragedy cuts deeper for this class of slave. You see, the more useful you were, the harder it was to escape. Owners guarded their skilled slaves. Some even insured them. And if you tried to run, well, a gladiator might get a broken leg. But a scholar, they'd break your fingers. Historians still argue whether some of these elite slaves had enough autonomy to count as quasi-free. Many lived independently, handled their own money, and negotiated contracts, yet they could still be sold, chained, or punished at any moment. A contradiction wrapped in a tunic. You step into a quiet side street now where the smell of ink hangs thick in the air. Inside, a young woman is copying scrolls by candlelight. Her fingers are stained black. Her owner nods proudly. She transcribes 3 volumes a week. No errors. Even earned praise from the magistrate. Her price astronomical. And don't forget the architects. Some of Rome's grandest buildings, the aqueducts, temples, and bathhouses, were designed by enslaved engineers. They drafted blueprints, supervised construction, even invented new techniques. Their owners took the credit. Of course. One well-preserved inscription even thanks a slave named Hermogenes for designing an entire marketplace. He's not called slave on the plaque, just property of Marcus Gavius. As if a paintbrush could sign its own masterpiece. But even in this world of talent and value, danger lurks. Skilled slaves often walked a fine line, valued enough to be envied, visible enough to be resented. A single mistake could drop their price. A single accusation ruin their life. You overhear a conversation between 2 buyers. That scribe, he's brilliant. But they say he leaked a client's will last year. Worthless now. Reputation was everything. A single scandal, real or imagined, could turn a prized artisan into a backroom bargain. And then there's the matter of language. Many high-value slaves spoke multiple tongues: Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Egyptian. In an empire spanning 3 continents, multilingual slaves were essential. They negotiated trade, translated foreign scripts, even served as cultural liaisons. Without them, half of Rome's diplomacy would have collapsed. You watch a young man translating between a Syrian merchant and a Roman senator. His speech is fluid, his gestures calm. He's not just relaying words, he's keeping the empire stitched together. And no one thanks him. So what did all this mean for price? A field hand might sell for 1,200 sesterces. A trained artisan, 8,000. A trilingual doctor, 30,000, 50,000, depending on specialty. These weren't just bodies. They were businesses. You sit now on the edge of a sunlit fountain watching skilled slaves drift past like unnoticed gears in a vast grinding machine. You realize the real tragedy: the better you were, the more tightly you were held. The slaves who lifted Rome weren't always the ones pulling carts or swinging hammers. Sometimes they were the ones designing aqueducts, tutoring senators' sons, or saving infants from fever. And the price of their brilliance, a number, etched in wax, debated over dinner, casually tossed into a ledger like it didn't reflect an entire lifetime. So tonight, as the lamps flicker and your eyes grow heavy, think of that painter, that scribe, that scholar with no name. Rome built greatness on their minds and never let them forget they were owned. The morning air thickens with the scent of smoke and wheat as you leave the world of skilled labor behind and follow the cart trails outward, away from the marble columns and manicured courtyards into the farmlands that sprawl beyond the city walls. Here, the rhythm is simpler. Earth, sweat, grain. But even here in the open, under Rome's vast sky, slave prices whisper different numbers than they do in the city. You pass a creaking wagon loaded with firewood, drawn by a lanky man with sun-leathered skin. His collar tells you he's owned, though the casual way he chats with the oxen suggests he's been out here a long time. Rural slaves were everywhere, tilling fields, pruning vines, pressing olives, and they cost far less than their urban cousins. Because when it came to pricing, location mattered. Urban slaves, those scribes, tutors, doctors, cupbearers, and secretaries, you just saw fetched high prices due to their specialization, visibility, and luxury skills. But out here, a slave's worth was measured in bushels of grain, gallons of sweat, and how many stones they could carry before collapsing. A strong field laborer might sell for 1,000 to 1,500 sesterces, sometimes even less, if they were from recent war stock. And unlike urban slaves who might receive training or stipends, rural slaves were often untrained, illiterate, and expected to die in harness. Mainstream historical fact: the majority of Rome's slave population worked in agriculture. Vast estates called latifundia required constant labor. In many cases, these plantations were so large they formed their own microeconomies. Slaves were bought in bulk, housed in barracks, and watched over by harsh overseers known as vilici. You arrive at one of these estates now. A group of slaves is stooped in the fields, backs glinting with sweat. A foreman stands nearby, whip coiled at his hip, yelling about speed. No poetry here. No marble statues. Just dirt and yield. A trader nearby explains, "We buy 10 at once. Better margins. If 2 die, we still turn profit." The words spill out like grocery math. And here's where it gets grimmer. Farm slaves weren't always bought for life. They were bought for years. Some owners expected them to last only 5 to 10 years. After that, too broken, too slow, too expensive to feed. You watch a boy lift a basket of grapes and stagger. The foreman shouts. The boy recovers barely. He won't fetch a high price at next year's market. There was even an internal rural price scale. Vineyard slaves, for example, were slightly more expensive than grain laborers. Why? Because vineyards required precision and gentler hands. One wrong cut ruined the harvest. Olive pressers and shepherds, on the other hand, were typically stronger, often older, and usually cheaper. But cities added yet another layer of complexity. You walk back toward Rome, crossing a bridge where a seller is showcasing a domestic servant from the countryside. Knows how to bake churn and doesn't ask questions, he brags. Urban buyers look skeptical. One mutters, "Can she carry a tray without dropping it?" Another laughs. She'll panic the first time someone farts in marble halls. There it is, rural slaves were considered coarse, less refined, and therefore less valuable in city markets. Even if they had practical skills, they weren't trusted in elite Roman households. Their price tags dropped simply due to accent, posture, or manners. But sometimes the opposite happened. During food shortages, urban Romans turned to rural laborers for survival. A strong grain carrier suddenly became more useful than a flute player. In those moments, field slaves' value surged. Historians still argue about how consistent these fluctuations were. Some suggest city markets remained loyal to aesthetics and polish no matter the crisis. Others believe desperation changed the rules, at least temporarily. Either way, price tags were slippery, reacting to everything from droughts to gossip. You pause near a tavern on the city's edge. A wealthy landowner is arguing with a clerk over taxes. "I paid $2,000 for him. He cleared 5 acres last month. I want the deduction." The clerk shrugs. "Then register him in the rural census, not here." Taxes again. Always taxes. Here's a quirky tidbit for your collection. Rural slaves were sometimes rented to the city, especially for festivals or construction projects. This strange shuffle blurred the lines between rural and urban categories. One year, a vineyard worker might be stomping grapes, the next hauling bricks for a temple. His price re-evaluated on the spot. Flexibility came at a cost, and that cost was often measured in broken bodies. You walk along the edge of a marketplace now where returning landowners are selling off excess labor after harvest. One man points to a tired-looking woman with cracked hands. She's no good indoors. Give me 800. Another trader squints. 6, and she's lucky to get that. There's no mystery here, just utility. In fact, many estates kept detailed slave inventories listing age, strength, injuries, and current value. These weren't private documents, they were tools for estate management, like spreadsheets carved into stone. One surviving inventory from a farm in Etruria lists 52 slaves, each labeled by gender, task, and estimated resale value. You imagine being on that list. Unit 43 limps slightly churns butter talks too much. Not a flattering entry. But not all rural slaves were anonymous. Some gained reputations as exceptional plowmen, clever shepherds, or reliable delivery runners. These stars of the countryside sometimes fetched higher prices than low-tier urban laborers. Just don't expect to see their names on statues. You reach the outskirts of Rome again, pausing to watch a wagon full of unsold slaves creak down the road. They slump against one another, heads nodding with exhaustion. None speak. A merchant waves at them. Off to the Sabine Hills. Work them till winter. Then we'll see. You know what that means. If they survive, their prices might go up. If not, well, there are always more wars, more captives, because out here, beyond the marble and poetry, value is measured in calluses, not syllables. And if you're ever tempted to believe Rome was all literature and law, remember this. The empire fed itself on the backs of sunburnt slaves who cost less than a decent carpet. Their names are gone. Their prices remain. The road winds you back toward the center of Rome, but this time you don't stop at the markets or the outer fields. You take a left at a colonnade wrapped in ivy and enter a villa so decadent it feels like a theater set. Columns polished to a mirror sheen, floors inlaid with golden tiles, perfume drifting in the air like invisible music. Welcome to the world of the luxury slave. Forget plowhands and scribes. These are the slaves bought not out of need, but desire, status, image. These slaves pour wine that's older than some senators sing arias between courses, and know exactly how far to stand behind a couch without ever breathing too loudly. And their prices absolutely outrageous. You pass a seated noblewoman flicking her fan, as two girls kneel beside her, one braiding her hair with ivory pins, the other fanning her neck with peacock feathers. Neither speaks. They've been trained not to unless addressed. That training alone might have cost 10,000 sesterces just to teach silence. Mainstream historical fact. Among Rome's elite slaves were often used as living luxury goods. They were bought for their beauty, grace, obedience, and ability to enhance the appearance of leisure and refinement. These weren't workers, they were ornaments. A Nubian flute player imported from the south, 15,000 sesterces. A Syrian perfumer who could craft custom scents, 20,000. A one-of-a-kind dancer from Asia Minor. No price even listed, he's just called invaluable. You walk past a banquet in progress. The dining room triclinium is arranged like a dream, reclining guests, endless food, and gliding between couches, a squadron of perfect-bodied attendants. They move like dancers, never spill, never speak. One flick of a master's finger, and they vanish through a curtain. See that one, a guest whispers, pointing at a boy with painted eyes and gold chains. Imported from Parthia, walks like a deer, paid 35,000 for him. He says it like someone showing off a racehorse. And you get it now, these slaves aren't expensive because of what they do. They're expensive because of what they suggest. Owning them whispers to the world, I have money, I have taste, I can afford to waste. A Greek chef sweeps by in fine linen trailing spice scents. He nods respectfully to his master, but speaks to no one else. His meals are so revered that people actually ask to borrow him for special events. Yes, he's rentable. His weekly rate equivalent to a minor magistrate's salary. A luxury chef slave isn't rare in these parts. But finding one who can both prepare flaming dormice and recite Catullus while trimming a roast pig, that's niche excellence, and Rome loves a niche. Here's a quirky tidbit. Elite Romans sometimes coordinated the skin tone palette of their house slaves. That's right, some preferred symmetry, others contrast. A letter from one aristocrat requests 2 Iberians light-eyed to flank the darker ones for contrast during receptions. Interior design, human addition. In another corner, you find a room of body slaves, cubicularii, trained to dress, bathe, and literally pose beside their owners. Some are taught how to stand in front of mirrors to reflect light just right. Others are there simply to laugh softly at jokes. And each of them has a price often ranging from 8,000 to 30,000 sesterces, depending on appearance, training, and personality. Personality matters. At this level, it's not enough to be pretty. You must know when to smile, when to look thoughtful, when to vanish. One buyer comments as he inspects a young girl. Beautiful, but she frowns when nervous. I won't pay full. Historians still argue whether these luxury slaves had better lives or just more expensive chains. Some lived in relative comfort, enjoyed fine clothes and food, even received gifts. Others were punished for breaking aesthetic. One scratched wine tray back to the market. And then there were the slaves who weren't just luxury, they were novelty. Dwarfs, giants, albinos, twins, anything that stood out. In a city obsessed with spectacle, uniqueness sold for wild sums. A surviving invoice lists twin singers from Cappadocia, harmonized naturally, trained in Egyptian rhythm. Price 60,000 sesterces. You try to imagine them performing at a party lit by floating oil lamps, guests clapping as they sing in eerie sync. Their voices no doubt mesmerizing. Their fate probably forgotten when the next novelty arrived. And let's talk presentation. Elite sellers knew how to market luxury slaves. These weren't dusty auction blocks. These were velvet-curtained showrooms. Think Apple Store, but morally catastrophic. Slaves were perfumed, dressed, and introduced with a flair for drama. Imported from Delphi, trained in harp untouched, fluent in Latin and mild Greek. Each phrase was meant to raise the bid. One seller even hired a poet to write a sonnet about a boy's eyelashes. That sonnet accompanied the sale. You can't make this up. Inside another villa, you see a group of slaves rehearsing. Not working, rehearsing. A serving girl is practicing how to kneel without rustling silk. A wine pourer repeats the perfect motion of unsealing a jug. A foot washer adjusts her kneeling position to appear graceful yet humble. You think of performance art. You think of pageants. You think of servitude rebranded as elegance. Luxury slaves weren't about needs. They were about theatrical consumption. Every gesture choreographed, every whisper calculated to flatter the buyer's sense of superiority. And here's another dark detail: wealthy Romans sometimes auctioned luxury slaves as entertainment. Guests at a feast would bet on prices. How much for the singer? 10,000. Too low, watch this. Then the auctioneer would twirl the performer and take bids right there between courses. Owning wasn't enough. Demonstrating ownership was half the thrill. You leave the villa quietly, the scent of rose oil lingering on your cloak. Your thoughts feel heavier now, not just because of the cruelty, but because of the sheer banality of it. People turned into set pieces. Human beings assigned value not by effort or heart, but by aesthetic harmony. There's one last glimpse as you pass through the gate, a young girl no older than 12 adjusting the angle of her master's sandals before a dinner party. She does it perfectly, gracefully. She probably trained for weeks. She'll fetch a high price if they ever get bored of her. So now you know. Slavery in Rome wasn't always brutal chains and forced labor. Sometimes it was perfume and poetry. But don't be fooled. A gold collar is still a collar. You step back into the bustle of Rome's commercial district, now away from silk-lined courtyards, and back into the tangle of shouting voices and clattering hooves. This is where the slave trade becomes less about status and more about strategy. Here, price isn't just shaped by beauty or skill, but by the dry, dusty mechanisms of taxes, tariffs, and trade regulations. You pass a gate where merchants queue under a sandstone arch, each holding a scroll, a purse, and a very tired slave. They're not waiting for buyers. They're waiting for Rome's most beloved bureaucratic tradition, paperwork. Because as rich and ancient as Rome was, nothing could escape its love of taxes, not even slaves. Mainstream historical fact, slave sales were taxed. The centesima rerum venalium was a 1% sales tax applied to most goods in Rome, and yes, that included slaves. Every transaction had to be recorded, and in larger cities, especially Rome itself, slave dealers had to register their sales with official scribes. You watch one merchant grumble as he hands over a coin and signs a scroll. Paid 1,000 for him and another 10 just to sell him legally. Highway robbery. He waves the receipt like a wet fish. But taxes were just the beginning. Tariffs were levied at ports and borders. If you bought a slave from Syria, Egypt, or Britannia, you had to pay an import fee, often calculated based on region, gender, and assumed value potential. Some sellers tried to game this by disguising origins or bribing dock inspectors. One particularly shady dealer whispers to a customer, "Tell them he's Gallic, not Iberian. That cuts your tax by 15 sesterces." Rome's customs officials weren't fools, though. You pass one now squinting suspiciously at a cargo manifest. "This one speaks Punic," he mutters. You listed him as Cappadocian. The fine double tariff. Here's a quirky tidbit: slave dealers occasionally dyed their merchandise's hair to match regional stereotypes and lower tariffs. Blonder must be Germanic, cheaper tax. Never mind that the man spoke perfect Aramaic. The manipulation didn't stop there. Some dealers intentionally underreported sale prices to avoid higher tax brackets. It was a delicate dance report, too low, and you risk suspicion. Report too high, and Rome's treasury gets fat. Historians still argue whether these sale records accurately reflected the true price of slaves. You overhear a young scholar say as he copies transaction summaries onto parchment. Half of what we know may be deliberate tax lies. He's probably right. Now here's the part that really complicates things. Not all slave sales were private. Rome itself, yes, the state owned, sold, and sometimes rented slaves. These public slaves, or servi pubblici, had their own regulations. Buying one meant navigating state contracts that dictated pricing, purpose, and duration. You pass a small auction run by city officials. A sign reads, "3 laborers' property of the state. Used in aqueduct maintenance. Clean record. Government rate 900 sesterces each. No haggling, no flair. Just quiet, efficient bureaucracy." Some of these slaves were rented on government projects, repairing roads, cleaning temples, even managing public baths. Because they belonged to Rome itself, their prices were fixed, not market-driven. No inflation, no bribes, just cold numbers. But sometimes those numbers weren't kind. You watch a man holding a scroll detailing repairs on a collapsed bridge. We'll need 8 men, preferably with experience in scaffolding. Budget's tight. Rent them from the state, not private markets. It's cheaper. He doesn't look up from the parchment as he says it. And here's where things get sticky. The laws around pricing varied wildly from province to province. A tax applied in Rome might not apply in Antioch. Some local governors enforced imperial price ceilings, others didn't. Some markets required notarized transactions. Others just needed a handshake and a curse. You imagine trying to price match slaves across the empire like checking hotel rates. This same cook costs 100 in Athens, but only 850 in Alexandria. Can we ship him? Sometimes they did. There was even a secondary economy based on transporting slaves to regions where they'd sell for more. This wasn't smuggling, it was just aggressive market strategy, like flying a product to a higher-paying customer base. One dealer boasts to a colleague, "Brought this dancer up from Syria. Double the price in Naples. Easy coin." Of course, moving slaves came with risks, disease, escape, injury. One invoice lists 2 slaves who spoiled en route and were sold at a loss. Spoiled, like bad cheese. You step into a tax office now more out of morbid curiosity than necessity. The room smells like wax and ink and sweat. One clerk is arguing with a merchant over category classifications. If he plays the lute and serves wine, is he a performer or a butler? Does it matter? It does, if we're calculating the occupational tariff. A pause. I'll list him as a decorative asset. Lowest rate. Another pause. Fine. But if he drops a tray, I'm coming back. That's the game, everyone bending rules, stretching labels, trying to dodge taxes while the state claw at every sale. Even registration marks came into play. Some slaves were branded with tiny letters on their arms, shoulders, or foreheads, proof of official sale, not just ownership. A state-inspected slave fetched a higher price because it meant the sale was clean. No hidden debts, no secret illnesses. Of course, some sellers forged those brands, because of course they did. Rome's slave economy was deeply legalistic, but also riddled with loopholes, cheats, and legal gray zones. And all of it, every ounce of it, factored into price. You leave the office just as a merchant storms out shouting 3% tariff on musicians now. What's next? Singing taxes, probably. And yet this bureaucratic mess had a strange side effect. It stabilized the market. With all its flaws, Rome's obsession with documenting and taxing slave sales created a kind of pricing standard. Buyers knew what to expect. Sellers knew where to cut corners. And the slaves, they knew the weight of numbers that followed them everywhere. As you walk away from the square, you pass a woman wiping tears from her cheek as a tax clerk stamps a receipt. Her husband maybe stands in chains beside her. Registered, the clerk mutters. Paid. Done. A number replaces a name. An official seal replaces a life. And tomorrow that receipt becomes a legal document. A piece of Rome's great accounting book. One line among millions. But you'll remember his face. You're standing on the edge of a market square again, but this one is quieter, smaller. No bright banners, no dramatic announcements. Just a few traders in worn cloaks, hushed conversations, and a row of tired children sitting under a canvas tarp. This isn't a public spectacle. This is where the future is bought and sold. Tonight you've stepped into the realm of child slaves, and the brutal economics of long-term value. You already know how gender skill and location shape price, but now you're about to see how Romans viewed not just what a slave was, but what they might become. You watch as a boy no older than 8 is inspected. The buyer presses his thumb against the child's ribs, mutters about bone structure, and then checks his teeth. The boy doesn't flinch. He's been taught not to. The seller nods. He'll grow into a strong one. Good investment. There's that word again. Investment. Because in Rome, buying a child wasn't just about price. It was about potential. Mainstream historical fact. Children were widely trafficked across the Roman Empire and were sold at lower upfront costs, often ranging from 500 to 1,200 sesterces, depending on age, health, and origin. The logic was cold. You paid less, now raised them under your rules, and after a few years of food and obedience training, you had a productive adult slave who knew no other life. You pass another seller advertising a 10-year-old girl with the sales pitch. Still learning, pliable. Will be loyal. Hasn't picked up bad habits. The buyer squints. Does she cry much? The seller shrugs. Only at night. And there it is again, the long game. Children were seen as high-risk, high-reward assets. They were harder to manage in the short term, less useful for labor prone to illness, but far more valuable over time. A child raised in a Roman household could be trained to speak Latin fluently, serve gracefully, and develop loyalty not just to the family, but to the system that raised them. You can hear the logic echo in a merchant's voice nearby. Buy them young, train them early, sell them mature. As if they were talking about bonsai trees. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some wealthy Romans kept ledgers tracking their child slaves' growth like one would track a wine collection. Age 8, slow speech. Age 9, improved manners. Age 10, taught to read. Their rising value was noted like stock prices. And then there were the buyers who weren't looking to train a future cook or servant, but a future companion. You glance across the square and see a man eyeing a boy with an unsettling focus. The seller leans in. He's quiet, gentle, learns quickly. The man nods and counts out coin without asking for a demonstration. Yes, youthful innocence itself had value, not for what it would become, but for what it symbolized in the present docility, beauty, obedience. Certain buyers paid premiums for slaves still in their pure years, often under 12. Inscriptions found in Pompeii hint at slaves being priced not by role but by voice, pitch, limb softness, even eye size. One transaction reads, "Girl 9, large eyes, walks gracefully." 200 sesterces. That's not labor evaluation. That's aesthetic math. And it gets darker. You hear a seller whispering to a prospective buyer. Born in the house, never knew freedom, no risk of escape. The buyer smiles. Perfect. They shake hands. That child priceless to them. Because what better slave than one who doesn't remember being anything else? Historians still argue about how often children were separated from their parents upon sale. Some evidence suggests entire families were broken at auction, while other records show children kept alongside mothers for nursing. But the general pattern is clear: children were seen less as people and more as clay. Malleable, reshaped, molded into whatever their buyer required. You stop beside a ledger pinned to a wooden board. It lists prices for prepubescence like a chart. Age 5, 500 sesterces. Age 7, 700 sesterces. Age 10, 1,000 sesterces. Age 12, 400 sesterces if trained. The notes scribbled below mention extra fees for singing instruction or grooming. Must be sweet-faced, one note reads, or discount applies. You have to sit for a moment. A child nearby is humming softly while braiding string into a knot. Her tunic is too big, likely second-hand. Her hair is neat. Her future is already priced out to the decimal. In wealthier households, child slaves were sometimes raised alongside the owner's children as playmates, tutors, or simply background decor. But don't be fooled. That familiarity didn't equal freedom. In fact, it often made control easier. The lines blurred, but the chains stayed. You pass a fountain where two boys are sweeping petals into the drain. They look nearly identical. Twins, likely. That would have doubled their price. Matching child slaves were a status symbol in elite homes. Dressed alike. Moving in sync. One senator's record mentions twin girls matched in dress and voice kept to sing in alternation at private meals. And if one got sick, the price of the other dropped too. You feel your throat tighten. The numbers are more cruel when they're written in crayon. Still, there were buyers who purchased children for more pragmatic reasons. A young boy could be trained as a messenger, a runner, a stable hand. A girl might become a maid, a cook, a nursemaid. Some were purchased simply to care for other slaves' children. Yes, child slaves bought to babysit other slaves' children. The Roman economy never missed a trick, and some buyers hoped for natural growth. If the child reached maturity and developed rare skills or beauty, their price could multiply tenfold. An early investment turned into a high-value asset, or more often a lifetime of labor that required less punishment because the training had already done the breaking. But it didn't always go that way. You hear one merchant mutter, "Bought him at 6, sick by 10, lost money, lost money." He doesn't mention the name. As the sun drops behind the rooftops, the children are herded back into the shaded pen. Some are curled up, already asleep on mats. Others stare at the sky like it might hold a better tomorrow. It won't. Not here. Because in Rome, children weren't spared. They were scouted, selected, and shaped. Bought not for who they were, but who they might become. And every skipped meal, every obedient nod, every inch of growth was measured in sesterces. Tomorrow, someone will walk through this market looking for a future servant, or singer, or worse. They'll pick the one who doesn't cry, who holds still, who looks up with big, silent eyes, and the seller will say, "This one's ready." The road out of the children's market takes you along the Tiber, where trade ships creak at dock and foreign tongues fill the air. The water carries smells of salt spices, wet rope, and something darker, something iron and human. You glance toward a thick-beamed ship as slaves are marched down the gangplank, blinking in the Roman sun like moles dragged into daylight. And suddenly, you're in a different market entirely. Because tonight, you're diving into the question, how did a slave's region of origin affect their price? It turns out, everything about a slave's value could shift based on where they came from. Skin color, language, temperament, stereotypes, cultural prestige, and even rumors of magical abilities. Romans were nothing if not opinionated about geography. Mainstream historical fact, Rome's slave economy was an empire-wide network. Captives were taken or bought from Gaul. Britannia, Germania, Dacia, Thrace, Greece, Egypt, Syria, Judea, Nubia, Numidia, Cappadocia, and more. The entire Mediterranean functioned like a live catalog of human merchandise. And each type came with a price range. You hear it as you pass a group of traders, Gaul, big, dumb, strong fieldwork. Egyptian, elegant hands, scribe or artist. Syrian, expensive, pretty, good with perfume. Germanic, dangerous. Buy two and chain them together. Greek, high class, literate. Teach your kids. You pause, half expecting someone to open a menu and start pointing. The prejudices ran deep, and they ran through coins. A Greek slave, especially one from Athens or Rhodes, could be astronomically priced up to 40,000 sesterces if he came with education and a reputation. Roman elites fetishized Greek culture. They wanted their homes filled with it. Greek tutors, Greek sculptors, Greek lovers. To own a Greek was to own sophistication. Meanwhile, Gauls and Germans were seen as physically strong but intellectually suspect. A Gallic farm laborer might fetch 200 to 1,800 sesterces, whereas a Germanic man might go for less or more, depending on whether you were buying him for his muscles or the arena. You pass a cage where a towering blonde man glares out at the crowd. He doesn't move, doesn't speak. The seller grins. Don't worry, we broke him. Just needs feeding. You're not convinced. Egyptians and Syrians were often prized for refinement. Art, music, cosmetics, religious knowledge. A perfumer from Alexandria could cost as much as 25,000 sesterces if trained. You spot one now holding a small flask and dabbing someone's wrist with oil. The customer inhales. Jasmine and civet. Perfect. The seller beams. He blends by scent alone. And then there were the Nubians from the far south. Their skin alone made them exotic in Roman eyes. You pass a group of dark-skinned girls dressed in fine linen, each marked as decorative household attendants. That's code for expensive aesthetic, meant to be seen, not heard. Their price, easily 15,000 each, sometimes more if sold in matching sets. A nearby buyer sneers. Fool paid double just because they came from the same village. Thinks symmetry makes them smarter. Historians still argue whether this pricing was driven by real skill differentials or just cultural bias. Some argue Greek slaves were better educated and so fetched more. Others believe the prestige of Greekness, mythologized, exaggerated, was what inflated their value. Either way, Rome bought into it. Hard. Now here's a quirky tidbit. Some sellers forged a slave's origin to inflate price. One letter from a dealer in Ostia brags, dyed his hair, taught him 3 Greek words, sold him as Rhodian. Tripled my coin. Buyers weren't always fooled, but sometimes they didn't care. A beautiful face with the right accent could fetch a fortune regardless of birthplace. There was also a market for Judean slaves, especially after the Jewish-Roman wars. Tens of thousands were brought back as prisoners. Many were sold cheaply due to religious tensions and fear of rebellion. They don't mix, one buyer mutters. Too proud, too strange. Yet in some parts of the empire, Judean slaves were used for religious or household roles. Quiet, one seller says. Knows scripture. Doesn't eat pork. Clean habits. It's the same voice someone might use when advertising a hypoallergenic cat. You cross into the harbor market, where new arrivals are being sorted. Each is tagged by name or lack thereof, age, health, and origin. One man is listed as Numidian skilled rider. Another Briton stubborn, needs firm hand. A third Cappadocian quiet artistic. And yes, even personality stereotypes attached to regions. Cappadocians were seen as shy but creative. Parthians as proud. Dacians as rowdy. Thracians hot-tempered. One seller warns, don't house Thracians together, they'll bite. You watch a buyer pass over a small man because he looks too Carthaginian. You don't know what that means, but apparently the price wasn't right. And there's the opposite end. Slaves from obscure or remote regions could become luxury items simply because they were rare. Romans loved novelty. A girl from a mysterious island near Britannia was once sold at triple market value just because no one knew what language she spoke. You pass a whispering trader now showing off a boy with dark red hair and mismatched eyes. From the steppe, he says, sings in a language no one's heard. That alone is raising bids. Of course, origin wasn't just about cost, it was about function. Some were bought specifically for their regional traits. Want a bodyguard? Get a German. Want a tutor? Get a Greek. Need someone for temple rituals? A Nab, an Egyptian. Rome turned culture into currency. And if a slave lost their accent or had no clear origin, their price could drop. Buyers wanted backstory, provenance. That strange little word, authenticity, even in human lives. And so as the harbor settles into dusk and the last of the ships are unloaded, you begin to see it. A Roman slave's price wasn't just about muscles or skills, it was geography, myth, and stereotype wrapped into a number. From the mountains of Thrace to the sands of Africa, every region became a brand. Every accent a label, and every face a calculation. The empire didn't just conquer people, it categorized them. The harbor fades behind you now, swallowed by torchlight and evening mist, as your feet carry you toward a quieter part of Rome, one without cheering crowds or shouting merchants. The streets here feel different. The slaves move with purpose, not panic. Their tunics are uniform. Their postures straight-backed, almost professional. You've wandered into the realm of public slaves, those not owned by citizens, merchants, or aristocrats, but by the state itself. And tonight, you're going to discover how their prices followed entirely different rules. There's no marketplace here, no barkers, no hagglers. Instead, you pass a government building where two slaves are scrubbing the marble steps with practiced ease. One glances at you. No fear, no curiosity. Just the kind of focused indifference you find in people who've done the same task every day for 15 years. You might expect public slaves to have been treated worse or better than private ones. But the truth is, they were priced, managed, and maintained in a separate category altogether. Mainstream historical fact, servi pubblici, public slaves were owned by the Roman state, municipal governments, or temples. They worked in infrastructure, civic administration, religious services, and even urban maintenance. You've seen their work 100 times without knowing: repairing aqueducts, copying legal scrolls, maintaining libraries, lighting street lamps. And unlike their private counterparts, their prices were fixed. That's right, Rome didn't haggle over public property. Records show that a state-employed scribe might be priced at 5,000 sesterces, while a municipal carpenter might be 3,000. These weren't auction numbers. These were budget lines often inscribed in city ledgers like tools or oxen. You peek into a tabularium, Rome's records office, where public slaves scribble across tablets by lamplight. Their faces are calm. One hums quietly. His worth isn't debated. It's itemized. And here's the twist: public slaves weren't always captives. Some were born into it. Others were condemned. A few were even freedmen who sold themselves back into state service during times of hardship, hoping for stability over starvation. You watch one older man at a temple gate nodding rhythmically as he sweeps. A carved placard nearby reads, "Property of the Temple of Fortuna." He's part janitor, part sacred presence. And he's not for sale, not in the usual way. But still, there's a number. You overhear a magistrate discussing maintenance needs. Hire 6 more. 1 for the latrines, 3 for the public fountain, 2 for scroll copying. Budget 9,000. He never mentions names, just functions. Here's a quirky tidbit: some wealthy Romans donated slaves to the state for tax write-offs or public praise. A stone inscription from Pompeii reads, "Lucius Sempronius gave 3 scribes and 2 street sweepers to the city. May his name be remembered." Free branding, free labor, win-win. You continue past a courtroom where public slaves handle records, scrolls, even minor translation. They don't speak unless asked. But when they do, their Latin is perfect, polished, practiced. It's easy to forget they're slaves at all until you notice the collars. each stamped with an inventory number. Public slaves were more regulated than private ones. Some even had uniforms. A few were permitted small wages stipends for their service, especially those who managed public baths, libraries, or offices. These stipends weren't generosity, they were incentives. Rome wanted its state assets working well. Historians still argue whether these stipends counted as wages or allowances. Did they grant autonomy? Could public slaves buy their freedom faster than private ones? The answers are fuzzy depending on city period and patron. But one thing is clear, public ownership didn't mean leniency. If a public slave stole, misfiled, or disrespected, an official punishment came swiftly, sometimes harsher than in private homes, because their actions reflected not a master, but the state. You pass a granary now, where slaves are stacking grain sacks into perfect rows. They wear matching belts. One coughs and is immediately pulled aside by a steward. "Rest," he says. "We'll deduct the hour." Efficiency. Rome loved it even more than cruelty. There's a small group of temple slaves nearby dusting statues and refilling oil lamps. Their role is both practical and sacred. Some were chosen young, raised in silence, trained in ritual. And yes, they were priced too. A temple might list: attendant literate age, 15. 3 to 500 sesterces. Oil keeper blind age 40, 800 sesterces. Musician trained in lyre, 200 sesterces. You stare at the musician as she tunes a lyre with careful fingers. Her eyes are half closed. She's played this melody 1,000 times. Her price is carved somewhere on a tablet in a back room. No audience ever asks. Now here's something rarer: state-owned slaves who rose in rank. Some became supervisors, procuratores, managing other slaves or entire departments. They were still enslaved, but wielded authority keys and occasionally respect. You meet one now. He wears a dark tunic and carries a wax tablet. He nods at passing citizens. Even a senator pauses to acknowledge him. He's been here for decades, knows every scroll, every corridor. His value isn't just physical, it's institutional memory. Try putting a price on that. And then there's the unspoken reality: public slaves were often invisible to the very citizens they served. Their work, cleaning, copying, hauling, was background noise. Necessary, but uncelebrated. No one tips the man who cleans the aqueduct. But every one of them carried a number, set by Rome, logged by scribes, and sometimes sold again when no longer useful. You overhear a chilling phrase as a magistrate folds his cloak. Retire him. List for disposal. Not death, just resale. But close enough. You exit the civic quarter now, passing one last temple. A slave inside bows, holding a tray of coins and incense. He doesn't blink. His hands don't tremble. His role is sacred. His price is fixed. His life routine. And yet you can't help but feel it, the strangeness of slavery without spectacle. No shouting bids, no drama. Just a quiet system humming in the background of empire. The state didn't need you to scream. It just needed you to function. Public or private, branded or collared. Rome didn't care who you were, only what you were worth. The stars are out now, shimmering over the rooftops of Rome, but the city hasn't quieted. You find yourself walking beneath columns carved with vines toward flickering torches and strange echoing chants. The smell of burning myrrh hangs in the air, and you realize you've entered a different kind of domain. Not civic, not domestic. Sacred. Tonight you explore a corner of the Roman world, where slavery took on an unusual twist: religious slaves and sacred service roles, where price and purpose were tangled in ritual secrecy and power. It's quieter here, not somber but controlled. You feel it instantly. There are slaves here, yes, but no one shouts at them. No one dares. Because these aren't field hands or auction lot extras. These are instruments of the gods, or at least, of the priests. Mainstream historical fact. Many temples across the Roman Empire owned slaves. Some were given as offerings by wealthy patrons. Others were purchased by temple funds, and once dedicated to a deity, these slaves belonged to the sacred institution, not to any individual. You pass a row of them now, young men in white robes sweeping the temple floor in silence. Their heads are shaved. Their sandals don't squeak. They move like part of the building itself. One is lighting candles at the base of a marble statue. Another is preparing ritual wine. You watch as a high-ranking priest snaps his fingers and a girl appears with perfumed water. They aren't chained, but don't let that fool you. These roles are permanent, and their market price surprisingly high. Temple slaves needed to be calm, clean-educated in rites, and capable of enduring long periods of silence or monotony. That narrowed the pool and raised the value. A trained temple attendant from Delos might cost 5,000 to 8,000 sesterces. One with musical ability, 10,000 plus. And if they were chosen young and raised inside the temple, their price couldn't even be estimated. You pause near a priest recording inventory. He's listing amphorae of oil bronze bowls and humans, 2 water carriers, 1 incense preparer, 1 acolyte injured foot reduce value. You glance at the acolyte. She limps slightly, still bows, still smiles. And here's a quirky tidbit: some temples branded their slaves not with collars but tattoos. On the forehead, wrist, or inner arm, small glyphs representing the god they served. A mark of devotion, or ownership, or both. You spot one now. A boy arranging fruit on an altar has a tiny trident etched into the base of his neck. Neptune's property. Not Rome's, not yours. Neptune's. It feels colder than a collar somehow, and the hierarchy doesn't stop there. There were sacred scribes trained to copy liturgical texts, omens, or divinations. Their handwriting had to be perfect. Their hands priceless. Their price tags sky high, especially if they came from Alexandria, where mystical traditions ran deep. And then there were the dream interpreters. Some temples kept enslaved seers, young boys or girls trained to sleep in sacred chambers and deliver messages from the gods. Their accuracy or performance determined their longevity. You overhear a priest whisper, "This one dreamt of fire last week, averted a grain fire in Ostia. The merchant paid triple his price in offerings." Historians still argue whether these interpreters actually believed or were coached. Did they experience visions or just repeat what they were taught? Either way, the temples valued them, and that value was tracked in ledgers. But not all sacred slaves lived in grandeur. Some worked the temple kitchens, cleansing baths, or animal pens. Dirty jobs, sacred jobs, but not glamorous. Their price ranged from 800 to 1,500 sesterces, depending on strength, not piety. You catch a glimpse of one girl hauling baskets of entrails from a sacrificial pit. Her face is streaked with ash. Her eyes are tired. But when the temple bell rings, she stops and bows. She still knows the rhythm. Temple life wasn't freedom. It was routine, order, obedience carved into ritual, and sometimes silence itself was sold. There are whispers of slaves sold to temples because of what they knew. A scandal, a secret, a threat. To keep them alive but hidden, they were gifted to the gods. their price negotiated in private, not for skill or body, but for what they would never say again. You imagine that conversation. Don't kill him, just make him disappear. To Neptune, to anyone holy enough to keep him quiet. Then there were slaves used in mystery cults, secretive religious groups like the worshippers of Isis or Mithras. These cults required ritual assistants, actors, initiates, sometimes purchased, sometimes trained. Their prices weren't recorded in state ledgers but in cryptic inscriptions or whispered agreements. One piece of graffiti in Ostia reads, "The girl from Antioch, paid in silver, taught the song Now Dances by Firelight." Who wrote it, no one knows, but someone paid, and someone danced. And then there's the rarest of the rare, the sacred freed slave. Occasionally a temple would grant manumission to a particularly loyal or useful slave. They remained in service but as a libertus Dei, freed person of the god. Technically no longer property, but still bound. A shrine near Ephesus still holds a statue of one such man. The inscription reads, "Freed by Apollo. May his hands continue in service." You realize that freedom in a temple doesn't feel free. It feels rebranded. You leave the temple complex, slowly stepping past arches that echo with long-forgotten chants. You can still see figures moving through shadowed corridors, bowls in hand, songs on their lips. They aren't screaming. They aren't chained. But they're priced, measured, watched, trained. In Rome, even the gods outsourced. Even silence had value. Even prayer had a cost. The temples disappear behind you, swallowed by incense and shadows, and you find yourself drawn now to a much grimier corner of the city. The streets are narrower, the smells more sour. Wine, sweat, mold. A man shouts drunkenly from a balcony. Below, a woman sobs into her apron. This isn't the Rome of senators and statues. This is the Rome of ruin. And tonight, we step into the strangest and saddest corridor of the Roman slave market, those who were not captured but condemned. People who sold themselves, people who lost everything, people who became slaves by choice or by force of law. It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Why would anyone choose slavery? But here's the brutal truth: in Rome sometimes, the only thing lower than being a slave was being a debtor, a criminal, or a failure. Mainstream historical fact: Rome allowed for voluntary slavery in certain cases. A person crushed by debt, unable to pay creditors, could legally sell themselves into slavery to satisfy what they owed. This was called nexum, and though officially phased out by the late Republic, variations of it continued in different forms, especially in the provinces. You hear it whispered now in a side alley, where a man with hollow eyes signs a crude agreement on a wax tablet. A merchant nods. 3 years of service. You'll be fed. Your family won't be touched. A moment later, the man is collared. His price technically zero, but practically a few hundred sesterces might change hands in arrangement fees. You walk past a registry office where a clerk mutters, "Self-surrendered. Took less than I thought." He stamps a seal and tosses the scroll aside like a shopping list. Self-sellers were desperate. Usually male, often aging, always poor. They'd lost land, borrowed too much, or made the wrong enemy. Becoming a slave wasn't dignity, it was survival. A roof over your head was worth your name. And it wasn't just men. You stop near a tavern door as 2 women are led out, wrists tied but loosely. The owner nods toward the buyer. Both debtors. One's good with fabrics. Other sings. That's all the information given. Their price barely 600 sesterces each, but the seller shrugs. Take them before the weather turns. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some self-sellers negotiated the terms of their servitude. They could stipulate a maximum number of years or agree to a specific role. One contract from a rural region reads, 3 years field work only with option for manumission if illness strikes. It sounds like a workplace contract until you remember that a human life is being reduced to bullet points. Then there are the criminals. You enter a forum court and watch as a judge slams a staff on the floor. Theft, repeat offense. You are sentenced to labor under the state. Term life. And just like that, the man is a slave. Rome used forced servitude as punishment. Convicted criminals, especially thieves, tax dodgers, or rebellious soldiers, could be condemned to slavery, often sold at discount rates due to their record. A healthy man might normally fetch 2,000 sesterces, but as a criminal, maybe 400. Buyers called it risk pricing. You call it buying damaged goods. Strong but arrogant, one dealer says as he gestures toward a shackled man. Good for quarries. Cheap. And yes, Rome had its penal labor markets. Harsh jobs, mines, mills, ship galleys were often staffed by these condemned men. They were usually branded with letters indicating their sentence. A fug on the forehead meant fugitivus runaway, a crime across the chest. Well, no mystery there. You overhear a merchant chuckle. Get 3 of those for the price of 1 Egyptian. Just don't expect them to last. Last. As in survive. And then there's the grimmest path into slavery abandonment. You round a corner and find a low-walled pen near the edge of the city. Inside are infants, toddlers, maybe 10 of them. A sign reads, no mothers, no owners, no questions. This is the columna lactaria, a milk column where unwanted babies were left. Technically, anyone could pick them up, and many did to raise them as slaves. The price 0 sesterces, but the value long-term. These abandoned children were often raised in slums or by slave dealers taught obedience early and sold as teens for 2,000 or more depending on skill and appearance. Some were even manufactured for sale. In poorer districts, women were known to bear children specifically to sell them. No documents, no fathers, just hungry mouths converted into cash 10 years later. Raise her clean, teach her to bow. Sell her at 15, one woman says, as she adjusts a toddler's tunic. The gods help her if she stays here. Historians still argue how widespread this practice really was. Was it fringe widespread, hidden behind euphemisms? The records are sparse, but the shadows are long. And if you think that's the bottom, wait. There were those who weren't even formally enslaved, but treated as such. Rome's social underbelly included people who acted like slaves without being owned. They lived in servants' quarters, worked without pay, obeyed orders because the alternative was starvation. They were called quasi-servi, or like slaves, and their price none, but their fate identical. You walk past a kitchen cellar now where 3 men are dicing vegetables in silence. No collars, no chains, just quiet resignation. The steward above them shrugs when asked. They eat here, they work here. No paperwork needed, no paperwork. No freedom either. And finally, there were those who weren't meant to be slaves, but became them through fraud. You stop at a stall where a furious young man is shouting, I'm freeborn, I was taken from Antioch, I had a ring, look for my ring. The seller rolls his eyes. They all say that, buy him or don't. The buyer frowns, glances at the man's hands, and shrugs. 300. The seller laughs. Sold. You don't know who's lying, but you do know what just happened. Someone was erased for the price of a goat. Because in Rome, not every slave was dragged in chains from the battlefield. Some walked in voluntarily, Some were pushed by desperation. Some were punished, betrayed, or simply born unlucky. But no matter how they got there, their price still ended up on a ledger. Reduced, rounded, approved. The market didn't care whether you came in with a crime, a debt, or a scream. It only cared what you were worth. It's early morning now, and the markets are waking up again, but this time you head toward a very particular kind of stall. Not the standard wooden platform or the shady alley behind a bathhouse. No, this is a performance stage, a showroom dressed up like a theater. Tonight you're about to uncover the dirty tricks, smoke, and mirrors behind every bid, the art of auction deceit and slave market manipulation. Because while Rome built aqueducts, wrote law codes, and claimed divine order, it also produced some of history's finest con artists. You reach a stall surrounded by curious onlookers where a beaming slave dealer stands like a stage magician. Ladies and gentlemen, he declares, I present to you the finest boy ever to walk from Thrace. Speaks 2 languages, sings like Apollo, and carries 10 amphorae at once. You glance at the boy. He's thin, pale, coughing into his sleeve. But the crowd's already interested. Mainstream historical fact, slave dealers, mangones, were notorious for stretching the truth, sometimes subtly, sometimes absurdly. They lied about origin, age, skills, temperament, even health. And because Rome's laws offered only limited protection for buyers, the marketplace became a game of who could lie better without getting caught. You pass a stall where a seller is applying lead-based powder to a slave's face to make them look younger. Another rubs oil into an old man's hands to make his fingers appear strong. A third is stuffing rags under a girl's tunic to suggest childbearing hips. Welcome to the illusion economy. And yes, there were rules. Rome required disclosure of defects at sale. If a slave was epileptic, prone to theft, violent, or had tried to escape before the seller was legally bound to mention it. If they didn't, the buyer could demand a refund. But here's the trick, only if the buyer noticed in time. A seller might say, no history of seizures, knowing full well that the boy convulsed last week. If the buyer didn't catch it before the contract was finalized, tough luck. Some sellers even trained slaves to hide symptoms like staying silent if they felt a tremor coming on, or pretending to limp until the auction ended, then walking straight. You overhear one saying proudly, "He's not dumb, just quiet." And by the time they figure that out, he's 100 miles away. And here's a quirky tidbit: slave dealers would sometimes dye slaves' hair to fake ethnicity or youth. A red-haired Gaul might be darkened and sold as Syrian. A Greek woman past 30, blonde dye teeth, scrubbed white with pumice, new tunic, voila, 22 from Delos. The performance didn't stop at looks. Slaves were coached on what to say or not say. Tell them you were trained in paestum. Say you're quiet by nature. Don't mention the burned villa or your last owner. Some even memorized fake resumes. One inscription recovered from a merchant's log reads, "Sold boy as cook. Actual experience none. Pretended to know lentil recipe. Buyer satisfied." It's like LinkedIn, but with shackles. And sometimes deception went the other way. Buyers pretended not to be interested in a particular slave, then drove the price down by pointing out supposed flaws. Too skinny, bad teeth, smells nervous, only to wink at the dealer after sealing the deal. It was all a game. You pass one stall where a bidding war is breaking out. 2 buyers shouting, waving coin pouches. The dealer eggs them on. Don't let him take this one home, just look at that posture, what no one notices. The boy's collar hides a burn scar from a punishment gone wrong. It's concealed with clay and dyed cloth. The buyer wins, pays double market rate. The dealer pockets the overage and never looks back. And what about bundling? Oh yes, that was a favorite tactic. You watch a dealer gesture toward a handsome girl. She comes with her nursemaid. Non-negotiable. Package sale. In reality, the nursemaid is old, ill, and mostly blind. But selling her solo wouldn't bring more than 200 sesterces. Wrapped in a bundle, she rides the wave of the girl's desirability. You hear the buyer grumble, "What am I going to do with this one?" The dealer shrugs, already counting his coin. Even more audacious, the planted bidder. Rome invented the fake rival buyer. Dealers would have accomplices in the crowd, drive up prices by pretending to bid. When the real buyer panicked and offered more than they intended, the fake bidder disappeared. It worked so well that some dealers used it every day. You pass one now. A smug-looking man just lost a bid he was never actually in. The real buyer glares at the emptying purse in his hands. "I should have walked away." You think you probably should have. Historians still argue how often Rome prosecuted fraud in the slave markets. Some records show legal action. Others suggest bribes and influence made enforcement laughable. As long as the taxes were paid, the city turned a blind eye. And yes, some slaves learned the game themselves. You overhear a whispered exchange. "Tell them you can write." "I can't write." "They won't ask you to. They just want to believe it." That boy might fetch 3 times his real value today, then be whipped tomorrow when his first wax tablet is illegible. But by then, the dealer will be long gone. You round the corner to the quieter stalls again, where the cheaper slaves are sold. No dyes here, no sweet perfume, just truth. Raw, uncomfortable, and unedited. The seller doesn't bother with the pitch. Crippled. Escaped once. Sullen. He gestures to the man beside him who glares at nothing. His price, 300 sesterces. No theater, no illusion, just pain out in the open. And somehow, it's more honest than all the velvet-draped lies in the main square. Rome's slave market was an economy, yes, but also a stage. The currency wasn't just coin. It was appearance, narrative, myth. Whether you were a doctor from Corinth or a girl who probably danced for Nero, your value was only as strong as the story someone could sell. And Rome bought stories. Every single day. You leave the marketplace behind, but not really. The echoes of it follow you, drifting down quieter streets and curling into every shadow. But now you're not following the slaves, you're following the dealers. Tonight you're stepping into the sandals of the men who made the whole system churn: the slave traders, the mangonis, the auctioneers, and middlemen of human lives. The ones who didn't just profit from slavery, they perfected it. And yes, they had price tags of their own. Not on their necks, but on their reputations. You stop outside a domus with an awning made of deep crimson cloth. The scent of imported oil hangs thick in the air, and golden lanterns gleam across a tiled sign: Domitius Felix, slaves of distinction. All backgrounds, all talents. Guaranteed quality. You smirk. It's a sales pitch in marble. Mainstream historical fact: Rome had an entire class of professional slave dealers known as mangones, or venaliciarii. They operated shops, warehouses, even traveling caravans, buying slaves in bulk from ports, wars, or local markets, then prepping them for resale at higher prices. Think used car dealership, but if the cars were alive and traumatized. You step through the arch and into a room that's half parlor, half theater. There's a low stage where a girl is being taught how to smile. A man walks her through postures. Stand with weight on the left foot. Hands loose. Don't blink too much when they ask your age. He's not a priest, not a master. He's a dealer. And here's where it gets strange: the good ones. They had a brand. A mango with a reputation for quality could charge more, not because the slaves were better, but because buyers trusted the product line. Think boutique shopping versus a sketchy stall. You overhear a customer say, "Felix's stock never bites." That's not a metaphor. You wander past a row of seated slaves, each wearing display tags, wax tablets hanging from their necks, listing skills, origin, temperament, and price. But also in tiny letters, the dealer's guarantee period. That's right, some dealers offered returns. You pass one tag, 20-year-old Thracian. Calm, former shepherd. No illnesses reported. 8-day return window. After that, no complaints. Rome had lemon laws for people. And not all dealers were honest, of course. But the best ones weren't the honest ones. They were the ones who knew how to skirt the line between law and lie. You spot Felix himself, short, rotund, wrapped in too much purple for a man without a title. His fingers glitter with rings. His hair is oiled and parted like Caesar's. He's telling a story to a potential buyer about how one of his slaves once cured a fever using only vinegar and prayer. You glance at the boy he's gesturing toward. He doesn't even look like he believes it. But the buyer nods. The price goes up. Quirky tidbit, some dealers were known for training slaves in one skill only just to create niche value. There were shops that specialized in nothing but cupbearers. Others, animal handlers, gladiatorial trainees, even mourners, yes. Slaves who were paid to cry at funerals. They were coached, polished, rehearsed, then sold with certificates. Rome had certification for grief. And don't assume these dealers worked solo. Most of them were part of networks. Middlemen at ports, scribes at the forum enforcers who tracked runaways. Even informants who alerted them to desperate families selling children. It was a supply chain. You pass a scroll inventory nailed to the wall. Dozens of names, ages, locations. 2 from Antioch delayed. 1 injured in transit. 3 girls unbroken hold for winter. That's logistics. Human logistics. And here's a darker twist. Some dealers bred their own stock. You stumble into a rear chamber where 3 pregnant women sit under a shaded arch. They're not married. They're not free. A younger dealer checks on them like a shepherd inspecting lambing ewes. "We'll raise the children in-house," he says. "Easier to train, smoother resale." Their children are born pre-priced. Historians still argue whether this practice was common or just an ugly edge case. Some say it was rare, too expensive, too long-term. Others argue it was a thriving undercurrent, especially among smaller-scale traders who couldn't afford to import fresh bodies. But here's what no one disputes. Dealers controlled the pipeline. War captives. The dealers greeted the ships, debt slaves. Dealers bought them up before the families even finished pleading. Runaways, captured, branded, resold. Children recycled through training programs like pets. And the very best of them knew how to sell anything. You watch Felix now as he ushers a nobleman toward a cage containing a scrawny boy, barely 10. "Looks weak," the man says. Felix leans in. Weak, he's fast, quiet, perfect for messages or private errands. You want a brute? Go to Ostia. You want loyalty? You're standing in front of it. The nobleman hesitates. Felix smiles gently, and he speaks Etruscan. The sale happens 30 seconds later. The boy says nothing. You pass the payment table where coin clinks like applause. An assistant logs the sale. Sold to Gaius for 1,800. Delivery by end of day. There's no ritual, no sorrow, just numbers. Rome didn't just run on slavery, it commodified the seller. Dealers were judged not by their morality, but by their efficiency. The best had reputation, reach, and rhetoric, and they kept the market full no matter how the wars or weather shifted. And when they died, their shops passed to sons or nephews or business partners. The signs changed, the paint faded, but the trade unbroken. You turn one last time to glance at Felix, who's now laughing with a senator over wine. He doesn't see slaves. He sees inventory, product, profit. And the next buyer walking through the arch might be you. The sun is beginning to set again, spilling long gold ribbons across the forum stones. You follow those rays now, not toward the markets, not toward the barracks or the temples, but toward something more private, more personal. Because tonight, you'll witness something rarely spoken aloud in the Roman world: the price of freedom. Welcome to the world of manumission, when a slave could in theory buy themselves back from bondage. It's a path paved in coins, favors loopholes and long, quiet suffering. But it was a path. And like everything in Rome, it came with a ledger line. Mainstream historical fact: manumission. The act of freeing a slave was not only possible in Rome, it was structured into law. Slaves could be freed by will, by public declaration, or by self-purchase if they had saved enough money. The freed person became a libertus freedman or freed woman, often tied to their former master's family. You stop at a fountain where an older man sits with a boy, quietly teaching him sums with a wax tablet. The boy nods, patient and focused. He's not learning for fun. He's learning for his life. Because saving to buy your freedom wasn't just about money, it was about math. A hard, brutal equation of years worked, tips, hoarded favors, collected punishments, avoided. You hear the man whisper, you don't ask what freedom costs. You ask who's selling it. And that's the twist. Not every master allowed self-purchase. Theoretically, a slave could offer to buy themselves, but unless the owner agreed, it meant nothing. Even with the full sum in hand, the answer could be no. Some owners teased it, used it, held it out like a reward, and pulled it back as punishment. One record from an estate lists Sextus, saved 5,000 sesterces, refused manumission, funds confiscated, now under restricted status. That's right. You could save your way into a worse cage. But for some, it worked. You pass a modest home, a libertus household, a freedman's house. You can tell by the tiny altar to the former master still carefully tended. It's not sentiment. It's obligation. Most freed slaves were still bound to their former owners as clients required to perform duties, make payments, or show loyalty. Manumission wasn't a clean slate. It was more like a gentler leash. Now for a number, the typical cost of freedom, if the owner agreed, might range from 1,000 to 10,000 sesterces, depending on the slave's age, skills, usefulness, and future value. A young man in his prime, trained in account keeping, easily 8,000. A worn-out field hand, maybe 200. And if the slave was aging or ill, sometimes nothing. Or worse, freed as a cost-saving measure. That's the unspoken version: freedom as abandonment. You watch a man be freed after years of carrying grain. He kneels, thanks his master, and walks away with trembling hands. The truth: he's 35, half-blind, and of no more use. The master just didn't want to pay for medicine or burial. "Congratulations," someone whispers. "You're free to starve." And yet real manumission, chosen, earned, did happen, especially in wealthier households where slaves worked closely with the family. A beloved tutor, a nursemaid, a trusted steward. These slaves sometimes earned freedom through loyalty or arranged deals to buy it over time. One account tells of a slave girl named Lydia who sang her mistress to sleep every night for 10 years. When the mistress died, Lydia was freed in the will, and left a small inheritance. You pause at a marble plaque nearby that reads, "To Lydia, singer and friend. Freed by love." Not every story ends that way, but some do. And here's a quirky tidbit: some slaves arranged to buy their own freedom with their master's money. They were allowed to work side jobs, running errands, tutoring, selling produce, and the master would collect a cut. Over time, the slave might accidentally accumulate enough to negotiate release. Yes, you could side hustle your way to liberty, but only if you survived long enough, played politics just right, and never looked too ambitious. You glanced toward a small slave-run tavern near the Subura. The manager, a former slave. His two assistants, still enslaved but saving. A whispered deal between them might go something like, "Cover for me tomorrow. Why, I'm teaching a merchant's daughter. 10 denarii. She worth that freedom is." And it wasn't just the slaves doing the math. Historians still argue whether manumission rates rose out of genuine generosity or calculated benefit. Freedmen became loyal clients. They voted with their patron's political bloc. They could open shops and pass wealth upward. It made financial sense to free a slave and keep the profits flowing. Which means, ironically, freedom became a new kind of investment. You meet an old man in the forum who says, "I was freed at 30, ran a bakery, sent my son to be a scribe, my former master. He still gets a share of every loaf. Is that freedom?" He smiles. It's close enough. And yet there were slaves who never tasted even that shadow of liberty. The ones sold too often, punished too much, or hated too deeply. Some saved every coin only to be betrayed. Others died before they got the chance. You pass a grave marker tucked behind a wall, weather-worn and humble. It reads, "Here lies Bion, who saved and served, freed in his final hour." You stare at it for a while, listening to the wind. Because for Bion, manumission was a number carved into a tombstone, a promise that came too late. And yet, he got there. Some didn't. And some, perhaps the most tragic, never even hoped. But for those who did, who counted coins in secret, who kept tally marks on their bunk walls, who recited prices in their sleep, the cost of freedom wasn't just numbers. It was everything. And when they finally handed that sum across the table, what they were really buying wasn't a life. It was the right to finally own themselves. Night falls again, but the air in Rome tonight is different, quieter. Not in the streets, those are always filled with carts, laughter, and shouting, but in the eyes of the people. There's a tension you can't name. You walk past a crowd gathered at a corner, not for bread or bidding, but for debate. One man stands on a crate arguing loudly. Even beasts don't enslave each other. Why should men? You pause. Because this is where slave prices begin to feel pressure from somewhere new. Not from war, not from weather, not even from economy, but from morals. Tonight you're witnessing the first cracks in Rome's granite certainty. The idea that slavery is natural, eternal, unquestioned. It isn't collapsing yet, but it's shifting. And those shifts, they begin to affect how slaves are treated, sold, and valued. Mainstream historical fact. As Rome matured, especially in the late Republic and early Empire, a number of philosophers, politicians, and even emperors began to publicly question aspects of slavery. Not abolition, never that, but treatment, abuse, and the moral cost of human ownership. You pass a shop selling scrolls of Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and advisor to Nero. His writings toy with dangerous ideas, like the notion that slaves have souls, that masters should not mistreat them, that fortune decides who is slave or free. One scroll reads, "A slave is a human being like you. He eats what you eat. He bleeds as you do. He laughs and fears and dreams. You imagine the slave dealers reading that and scoffing, wiping their hands on wax ledgers. But the whisper spreads. Not revolution, Rome was never fond of that, but reform, politeness, guidelines. Some senators start to free slaves upon reaching old age. Others offer basic wages. A few even ban branding in their households. Not out of kindness, out of image. You hear a young patrician brag to his friend, "I don't chain mine. They stay because they respect me." His friend rolls his eyes. Sure, until they don't. So how does this changing attitude affect prices in subtle but real ways? Buyers begin asking more questions about temperament, loyalty, education. There's a growing sense that the ideal slave is not the most broken, but the most assimilated. And that means they must be treated just well enough to stay that way. You pass a shop advertising ethically raised slaves. You nearly laugh until you realize the prices are higher than usual. A girl being sold for 12,000 sesterces raised in-house, never punished, fluent in Latin, sleeps indoors. It's not morality, it's marketing. Here's a quirky tidbit in the late 1st century CE. Some dealers began issuing certificates of kindness statements, claiming the slave was well treated, not beaten, taught letters. These scrolls were presented during auctions to increase trust and drive prices up. It worked. Wealthy buyers wanted slaves who looked happy, not for empathy, but because happy slaves were lower risk, less likely to escape, less likely to kill you in your sleep. You pass a tavern where a group of philosophers is debating loudly. Is it worse to own a man or to make him want to be owned? Ask the man. Ask his price tag. They laugh and sip their wine and nothing changes. But slowly, Rome begins to implement laws. The Lex Patronia circa 19 CE restricts masters from forcing slaves to fight wild animals without a magistrate's permission. Later laws arise to protect slaves from extreme abuse, limiting how they can be killed, allowing investigations into household deaths, even offering state asylum to abused slaves in rare cases. Historians still argue whether these laws were genuinely protective or merely reputation-saving for elite households. Some say they humanized slavery. Others say they sanitized it, made it easier to justify. Either way, the impact is real. Slave prices go up. Why? Because stricter rules make owning a slave more complex, more liability. If you mistreat one and it gets noticed, your reputation suffers, maybe even your legal standing. So what do buyers want? Safe slaves, trained slaves, obedient slaves, and those are expensive. You pass an auction where a dealer brags, raised by Stoics, knows Cicero, no history of rebellion, never punished. The buyer nods. Exactly what I need. My wife hates noise. That slave goes for 18,000 sesterces. And here's the irony, some slaves learn to play the system. They read the scrolls, they echo the philosophers. They act serene, loyal, pious, not because they believe it, because it raises their price. A girl polishing a lamp nearby glances at you and says, "I like Seneca. I pretend I'm free when I listen to him." She smiles. It makes them like me more. You nod. Then you realize her collar is polished too. The moral shift doesn't stop slavery, but it alters its flavor from raw brutality to cultivated oppression. Households begin training slaves not just in work, but in manners, ethics, gratitude. Some are taught to thank their owners at night. Some are taught to pray for them. Gratitude raises value, one scroll advises. A slave who smiles sells faster. You can't tell if you're angry or amazed, because even virtue has been absorbed into the market. There are whispers that Emperor Hadrian once dismissed a nobleman for whipping a slave unnecessarily. Another tale claims Marcus Aurelius freed a boy for reciting philosophy. Are they true? It doesn't matter. What matters is that buyers believe them and price accordingly. You pass one more auction house before turning in. A large placard reads, "Kindness is strength, trained with patience, disciplined with wisdom." It sounds noble, but next to it is a smaller chalkboard with numbers. Starting bid, no refunds. Buyer assumes responsibility. So tonight, you've learned that even when morality crept into the Roman Empire, it didn't weaken the slave market. It refined it, made it more polite, more careful. And in doing so, even the appearance of compassion became something you could buy. The cobblestones beneath your feet feel older now, rougher, as though the city itself is sagging under the weight of years. You've wandered into a Rome that's less golden, less polished. The marble has lost its shine. The laughter in the streets sounds more forced. You pass a once grand villa with vines choking its columns and laundry hanging where silk banners once waved. Tonight you step into the final chapters of Empire, the late Roman period, when cracks spidered through the system and even slavery began to change. This is the part where prices start to rise, not because slaves became more desirable, but because they were suddenly harder to get. Mainstream historical fact in the late Roman Empire, roughly from the 3rd century CE onward, Rome's expansion ground to a halt. The steady flood of foreign captives dried up. Military victories became defensive stands. Borders contracted. Revolts stirred. And just like that, the supply of slaves collapsed. You reach the old slave market and find it nearly deserted. A single cart groans with 2 ragged captives. The seller fans himself, bored. No stock this week. The last shipment was eaten by pirates or plague. Or both. He's not even joking. Rome, once drunk on endless conquest, was now starved of fresh bodies. And that changed everything. You overhear a merchant muttering to himself, "A good field slave costs as much as a villa these days. And no one wants to sell theirs. Who'll work the press if I let him go? Prices spike." A basic laborer who might have cost 200 sesterces a century ago is now going for 5,000 or more. A literate houseboy, unattainable. No one's selling their trained staff unless they're bankrupt or dying. And even then, the buyers line up like it's an estate auction. You pause at a rundown inn where a family huddles whispering over an old slave woman's fate. "She's still strong," the son says. "We could get 2,000, maybe more." "But who'll take care of your sisters?" the mother whispers. There's no answer. Only the sound of a coin purse being tested for weight. The value of a slave rose not just because of scarcity, but because Rome, once powered by chained hands, never built a replacement. The fields still needed planting. The presses still needed labor. The villas still demanded clean robes and hot meals. But the army no longer returned with captives. The markets grew sparse. And in desperation, Romans began turning to alternate systems. Here's your quirky tidbit. The late empire saw the rise of a new class, the colony. These were tenant farmers, technically free, but bound to land they couldn't leave. Think indentured peasants who replaced rural slaves. The line between slave and free blurred until it became something murky, like wet parchment. You walk past a vineyard where an old colonus tends vines, muttering prayers to Bacchus. His clothes are clean, but his feet are calloused like any slave's. You ask him if he's free. He shrugs. "Free to die in this field, I suppose." That's the transition as slavery became too expensive. Dependency systems took its place. Slaves were still bought and sold, but only by the elite. Everyone else, they found cheaper ways to trap people. You spot a broker nearby reading aloud from a scroll, "Terms work the land." Half the harvest goes to the owner. No relocation, no appeal, not a slave, just bound. The buyer nods. Good enough. But slavery didn't disappear. It simply became more precious. You pass a noble's estate, surprisingly quiet. Inside, a girl dusts shelves with delicate care. Her price, 15,000 sesterces. Why? 'Cause she's been here since she was 6. She knows the family. She can cook, speak Greek, and greet guests with precisely the right angle of deference. The master doesn't plan to sell her. He's protecting his last real asset. Historians still argue whether this scarcity led to better treatment or just hoarding. Some sources suggest elite households prized their slaves more. Others imply they were worked harder than ever. No replacements meant no mercy. You lean against a column and hear 2 senators debating policy. "We must limit manumission," one growls. "Free too many, and who'll serve the houses? But they're saving for it," the other says. "We taught them to." The first man snorts. "Then we taught them too well." In desperation, laws are passed to slow down freedom, to lock people in place, to prevent the market from collapsing further. Some regions ban selling slaves outside their province to prevent brain drain. Others try to tax manumission out of existence. But nothing stops the spiral. Even slave dealers are dwindling. You walk past Felix's old shop, remember him? The smug, purple-draped king of the auction block. The awning is faded. The lamps are gone. A new sign hangs in the window for lease. You peer inside and find only cobwebs and a single upturned stool. Even the sellers can't afford to sell anymore. You round a corner and meet a boy with a chained ankle sweeping the front steps of a merchant's villa. He's no more than 13. You ask his name. He doesn't answer. Not because he's afraid, because he's thinking. Then he says, "Used to be 5 of us. I'm the last." You ask what happened to the others. Sold, freed, died. You nod. His price too high for anyone to pay, or too low to justify replacing. He's caught in a shrinking system, the old ways failing the new ones not yet formed. Rome itself feels the same stone, crumbling roads, cracking orders, slowing. And with every crack, the slave market shrinks. Not out of kindness, out of entropy. You sit on a worn bench watching dust rise from the stones. You think about the auctioneers with no voices left to shout. The ships that stopped bringing bodies. The buyers with empty purses and full fields. The slaves who know they won't be replaced and don't know if that's a blessing or a curse. Because here at the empire's twilight, slavery still exists, but it's not stable, not profitable, not inevitable, just fragile. And tomorrow, maybe, just maybe, it breaks. The empire's sun may be fading, but your walk isn't over yet. You're not in Rome anymore. You've crossed seas and centuries now, stepping through a new kind of dust. Not the marble flakes of toppled forums, but the dry grit of medieval markets, colonial ports, and plantation soil. Because while Rome's slave prices rose, fell, and eventually collapsed, the model it created, it didn't vanish. Tonight we follow the echoes. The ways Roman systems of human pricing stretched forward, subtly reshaped, and reappeared in the shadows of empires yet to come. Because slavery ended in Rome, but it didn't really end. It mutated. Mainstream historical fact, many aspects of Roman slavery, its legal foundations, economic reasoning, and even social justifications would influence later slave economies throughout Europe and beyond, especially as Roman law was rediscovered and adapted during the medieval and early modern periods. You walk now through a medieval marketplace, not unlike the ones you've seen in Rome. The languages are different, the fashion is strange, but there near the center stall is something hauntingly familiar. A man standing on a wooden block, a placard around his neck, a buyer squinting at his teeth. You hear the words, healthy, quiet, no known rebellion. It's not Latin anymore, but it may as well be. Welcome to the legacy of Roman slave valuation. Medieval societies in Europe didn't reinstate Roman slavery in full, but they borrowed pieces. Serfdom, where peasants were tied to land bears, a chilling resemblance to late Roman tenant systems like the colony. And yes, manumission laws, contracts, and even price assessments often referenced Roman legal codes. One medieval court case in 12th century Spain cites a Roman precedent to justify whether a slave could inherit clothing after his master's death. You spot a ledger open on a table. It's from a Genoese trader. The year is 1292. His records include one female, Greek-speaking, 18 years old, 100 gold florins. One boy, branded origin unknown, 60 florins. One eunuch, literate, 230 florins, purchased from Alexandria. You look closer. There's a side note. Former Roman pricing comparison apply, 3:1 inflation ratio. They were still using Roman math, and the deeper you look, the worse it gets. The Portuguese slave trade in the 1400s. Structured using Roman models, especially in legal justification and shipping contracts. The partus sequitur ventrum principle, the idea that a child follows the status of the mother, has clear Roman precedent. So when colonizers arrived in West Africa, and later in the Americas, they didn't invent a new machine. They reactivated an old one. You're standing now in a Caribbean sugar port, 17th century. There's a row of shackled captives auctioned by height, strength, and even complexion, with lighter-skinned slaves sold for higher prices. Sound familiar? You remember the Roman auctions, where Syrian slaves fetched more for their refined features, where Thracians were praised for size, where Ethiopians were exoticized. The ethnic price tier is a Roman inheritance. Even the categories echo back: field worker, house servant, luxury body. Nothing was new, only amplified. You pass a colonial ledger written in perfect penmanship. One girl, 12 years, virgin, skilled in stitching, 180 silver coins. One man, 35, rebellious, scarred, auction discounted. Bundle lot, woman plus child, sold together at half rate. You could have read this in Pompeii, but now it's on parchment instead of wax. And the irony, these new systems saw themselves as civilized, enlightened, Christian. But Rome whispered from the grave, "We did this too. You just changed the words." Here's a quirky tidbit. Thomas Jefferson owned a copy of the Institutes of Gaius, a Roman legal textbook. It detailed slave law. It informed the early American legal tradition, including some justifications for slave ownership and property status. Even in modern courtrooms, traces of Roman logic lingered. And it wasn't just law, it was ideology. The idea that some people were natural slaves better suited to obedience, weaker in will or intellect. Aristotle said that. Seneca hinted at it. Roman society believed it. And centuries later, colonial empires resurrected it. Only now they called it science. Historians still argue whether this continuity was conscious, whether European slaveholders knew they were mimicking Roman systems, or whether the same economic pressures simply led to similar solutions. But in the ledgers, the prices, the categories, the DNA is there. You step into a southern U.S. plantation now, where an enslaved man is appraised for sale. A doctor checks his joints. A clerk lists age 27. no known illness. Blacksmith, no marks of punishment. It's $200. The phrasing is different. The logic is identical. He is not being valued for who he is. He is being priced for what he can do. Just like in Rome. The Romans didn't invent slavery, but they did something more insidious. They made it efficient, predictable, acceptable. And when their empire crumbled, that system lay in the dust like an old blueprint, waiting. You leave the plantation and find yourself finally in the present. The chains are gone. The markets are closed. But the echo's still there. In the laws we quote. In the statues we keep. In the assumptions we never question. Because the price of a Roman slave didn't just reflect the past. It shaped the future. And in some corners of the world, it still does. The streets are empty now. Rome, or what's left of it, sleeps beneath layers of ash memory and worn-out footsteps. You walk slowly through what was once the slave market square, but the wooden stages are gone. The noise, the shouting, the clang of coin on stone all vanished. Only wind now, only silence. And yet under that silence there is still something speaking. It's not a voice, it's a number. And tonight we face it one last time. The final leg of your journey leads not to a palace or a battlefield or a dungeon, but to the ledgers, the receipts, the scratched tablets, the crumbling estate accounts and forgotten scrolls. Because in the end, the story of slavery in Rome is not only about suffering, it's about valuation. It's about what a society chooses to measure. Mainstream historical fact, Roman slave prices were not arbitrary. They followed economic patterns, supply, demand, location, labor type, skill set. The slave market was deeply tied to Roman infrastructure, agriculture, education, politics, and even fashion trends. And in that predictability lies the horror. You stand now before a wax tablet from the 2nd century CE. It lists the following: Daphne flute girl from Corinth, 200 sesterces. Marcius quarry worker prone to escape, sesterces. Ammius boy from Alexandria reads and writes, 800 sesterces. Livilla pregnant, Gaulish origin. 1,000 sesterces, unconfirmed twins. Lucius mute, 750 sesterces, no refund after 10 days, no drama, no adjectives, just prices, just lives as inventory. Quirky tidbit: archaeologists have uncovered small price tags made of lead that were once tied to slaves' collars in larger estates, each stamped with weight, roll, and value. They look like dog tags, but the questions those prices raise, they echo louder than any tag could ring. Why was a cook worth more than a soldier? Why did a child cost more than a man? Why did speaking Greek add 3,000 sesterces to your fate? Why did a woman's fertility change her resale value more than her skills? Why was obedience priced but potential not? Historians still argue what these prices really meant. Were they cold economics, social rankings, indicators of fear, status, or desire? Or were they mirrors reflecting what Rome loved, needed, or loathed? Because when you look closely, the numbers reveal everything. They tell you Rome feared rebellion because docile slaves were priced higher. They tell you Rome valued appearance because beauty raised a girl's price more than fluency. They tell you Rome distrusted loyalty because return windows existed. They tell you Rome never forgot origin because Greek meant smart, Syrian meant sensual, Dacian meant muscle, and Ethiopian meant exotic. Each number whispered prejudice, Each bid reinforced a bias. Each sale was a quiet vote for what mattered. And over time, those quiet votes built the economy. And the economy built Rome. You remember walking through the temples, the taverns, the mines, the estates. You remember the girl learning to sing so she'd fetch more coin. The man who sold himself to escape debt. The old woman who'd outlived her use. The boy raised to fetch a high resale. None of them controlled the number carved into their tag. But every Roman who bought, sold, traded, or even considered those numbers, they built the system. You glance down at the last ledger of the night. It reads, total stock year 212 CE, 42 slaves. Market estimate 228,000 sesterces. Average per head 428 sesterces. It ends with a neat line, assets remain stable. That's it. No names, no voices, only value. And yet, behind each figure there is a heartbeat, a back bent under olive baskets, fingers ink-stained from letters, feet scarred from winter walks, hopes buried under layers of price policy and stone. Because the real story is not in what they were sold for, it's in what they were never allowed to become. And now, we're here. The market has emptied, the torches have gone out, and the footsteps of buyers and sellers have long faded into the cracks between stones. All that's left is you and the soft whisper of history still lingering in the air. You've walked through more than 20 centuries of Rome. You've stood at auction blocks and watched the numbers flicker like flames. You've seen the hands that held the ledgers, and you have heard the silence of those who were the ledger entries. And yet even now, with all the scrolls and receipts burned or buried, the echoes remain. They remain in the way systems still assign value, in how society still labels some lives as more useful, more desirable, more productive than others, and how worth is still calculated just without sesterces. But don't let that weigh you down. Let it settle softly, like dust after footsteps. Because tonight's journey wasn't about guilt. It wasn't about shame. It was about seeing quietly, clearly, how deeply numbers can cut, and how carefully they must be questioned. So take a breath. Let it stretch through your chest, warm and wide. The lights are low now. The story's finished. And wherever you are in your room, your city, your time zone, you've made it to the end. And maybe, just maybe, you'll remember this the next time you see a price tag. Because everything priced was once appraised. And sometimes what's not counted is what matters most. Good night. End of script. Sweet dreams.